If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button as well as the bell to be notified of future videos. Thank you.
Hello Internet, welcome back here. We are speaking today with General McGill Alexandra, a paratrooper general. He's telling us about his time with Group 18. It's a fascinating time. This is just before Mr. Mandela took over. In those years, there were a lot of things happening in South Africa. You really needed wisdom.
Okay, Chris. Well, thank you very much. It's good to talk again. And what I want to talk about today was the time that I spent at Group 18. I'm not sure whether I should call it township duty in Alexandra, in Johannesburg, and or whether I should say it was a period in my urban, say it was nothing more or less than a peacekeeping. Long before peacekeeping became a popular term in South Africa. The year that I spent there was a definitive year in my life. It had a huge effect on me and on my thinking, and perhaps on my future too. In some ways, it was a life-changing experience for me. And it was an experience that I entered into extremely reluctantly, very reluctantly. But first, I'd like to just share a couple of brief points, perhaps little slightly amusing anecdotes about my time when I was with 44 Para Brigade, and perhaps they will clarify some of the things that I've already said. The first is that I'm sure some people, perhaps especially the SAF people, would wonder how Brigadier Dick Lord of the SAF could have been so accommodating for the paratroopers and always so willing to help us out. Now, one has to understand that Dick Lord was the SAF commander in Southwest Africa during the war. And he was very aware of the role that the paratroopers played, and he was the person who would okay helicopters and send out helicopters for Casevacs and things like that. So he was very much in touch with the war. Despite being a fighter pilot who wouldn't have been deployed that often on operations, but he was very much in touch with the war that was going on there. And after that, when he was promoted to brigadier, he became the officer commanding the Air Force Command Post, which was an immensely powerful position within the Air Force, because he coordinated and commanded everything that the SAF did. He was overlooking all the SAF's doings and goings on. It was really a very, very important position. So one day I got hold of Dick Lord. And in fact, I actually went to his office to see him. And I said to him, Brigadier, we've got a water jump coming up, and I'm going to be asking for aircraft. And I'd really appreciate it if you'd consider giving us 2 or 3 Dakotas, because we've got a lot of troops that we want to drop, and it's going to take a lot of time to do it. And 1 Dakota's flying from Waterkloof to Roodeplaat Dam and back. It's just going to be too long. If we can have enough Dakotas in the air so that we can continually drop people and have, as a Dakota finishes, he goes back, and the next one is already waiting to start dropping its paratroopers. So 3 Dakotas would probably be the best. That if you could give us that. Of course, we'd welcome any more, but we'd be very happy if you could give us 3. So it was I went in with a typical negotiation attitude that I wanted to, but I didn't really have anything to give him, in this negotiation. So he says, Mac, I'll see what I can do to help you. And then he said something. He said, you know that I once did a parachute jump? So I said, no, sir, I never knew that. So he said, yes, it was a long time ago, and it was very far away. So I said, was that why when you were in the Fleet Air Arm, sir? Because he was in the RAF for about, I think he was there for about 6 or 7 years, maybe 8 years, I don't know, as a fighter pilot. So he said, yes, technically I was in the Fleet Air Arm. He said, but I was on 2-year secondment to the United States Navy, and I flew fighters from their carriers. And he says, and I was instructing at their school. I think it's somewhere in California or somewhere, and he said I was flying Phantoms and Skyhawks and so on. He said, and one day I was flying quite high over the Pacific, and I had a burnout with my aircraft, and I had to eject. He says, but the force of the ejection, I lost consciousness. And when I woke up, I was floating in the Pacific Ocean with my parachute floating next to me. He said, so I've done a parachute jump, and I have got no idea what it was like. So I don't know whether he was fishing, but if he wasn't fishing, I certainly grabbed the bait, because I saw now I could do something to that I could offer him, you see. So I said to him, Brigadier, would you like to do a parachute jump to see what it's like? So he smiled at me and he said, how would that be possible? So I said, well, if you come to us the day before our water jump, I'll put you through some training with one of my instructors. And then on the day of the water jump, you jump with us. And then not only will it give you an idea what a parachute jump is like, it'll tell you exactly what it is like to jump into the water. So he smiled at me and he said, you're on. I said, well, thank you very much, sir. Now, about those aircraft that we wanted, he said, don't you worry about that. I'll get that sorted out for you. So as I got up to leave, he said to me, Mac, as I got to the door, he said, Mac, he said, not a word about this to Chief of the Air Force, eh? So I said, of course not, sir, but on one condition. Not a word about it to Chief of the Army either. because we were both breaking regulations here. It was just not on. Chief of the Air Force was very reluctant to let any of his pilots parachute. We had, when we were training the MAOT, the Mobile Air Operations Team for the Air Force, we did get special permission to train a few of them as paratroopers. But it was quite a battle to get that permission. And Chief of the Air Force was very reluctant to let his pilots jump. He just didn't want anything to happen to them. And of course, Dick Lord was a key person in Air Force headquarters. He didn't want to put him at risk and so on. So, we didn't say, neither of us said anything to anyone. I called my sergeant major, who was the sergeant major of our training team at the brigade, Sergeant Major Luert Peterson. I called him in and I explained to him what was happening. And I said to him, Luert, I want you to train this brigadier. And you've got one afternoon to make him competent to be able to jump out of a Dakota and do a water jump. So don't worry about the landings, but you make sure you get the aircraft drill, the exit drill, and the flight drill 100% with this guy in one afternoon. And Ludwig Peterson looked at me and he said, Colonel, are we allowed to do this? So I said to him, Lud, that's not your problem. That's my problem. If anything goes wrong, you won't be in trouble. I'll be in trouble. Just do as I say. So he smiled at me and he said, yes, sir. And Dick Lord pitched up And I handed him over to Lodewijk, and he took him out to the training apparatus we had outside. And he had kept him there for several hours. And when he was finished, he brought him back to my office. And Dick Lord looked flushed and very excited. And, he'd been put through. I mean, he wasn't that young anymore, so he'd been put through his paces a little. He was probably well into his 50s already. And he said, well, thank you, Mac. I look forward to it. I'll see you tomorrow morning. I said to him, sir, I'll be on the DZ, so you won't be seeing me, because I wasn't going to let anybody else take responsibility for him if he got injured. So I said, I'll take the DZ. I'll jump later in the morning, but I'll take the DZ, and just to make sure that the aircraft drops him where it's supposed to drop him. And but I said to Lodewijk Peterson when the brigadier was gone, I asked him, I said, how did it go? He said to me, Colonel, that brigadier is hyper sharp. He's very switched on. I had to tell him to do a thing once and he got it right. Said I repeated it many times with him just to make sure that he didn't have any doubts, but he snapped everything right from the start. He knows exactly what to do. We don't have any problems with him. Said to him, nevertheless, Lord, tomorrow I want him to jump number 1. And I want you to jump number 2. And I want you to watch everything that goes on, make sure he gets into the door properly and that he goes out okay, and you go out straight after him. And if necessary, if you see that things are going haywire in the air, you just yell at him to try and get him to do the right thing. So that's what happened. Dick Lord jumped. He went out of that aircraft. I was on the ground watching and, controlling the aircraft. And I saw him come into the door and I watched his exit. He did a perfect exit. Feet together, compact position, parachute opened. He went through his drills in the air. He undid his harness. He came down holding onto the harness. As his feet touched the ground, he threw his arms into the air and the parachute drifted off away from him and he landed in the water, came up, he had a life vest on and the boat was there within seconds and collected him. I'd briefed the engineers who were manning the boats. I said to them, the first man, you pick him up very, very fast. Don't leave him in the water for any time. I picked him up and he brought him. When he landed, he came through to me and he was smiling broadly. He said, Mac, thank you so much. He said, that was a wonderful experience. I said to him, sir, we're going to be jumping all day. You want to go again? And so he said, no, thank you. I've done what I wanted to do. That was wonderful. Thank you so much. And that was it. And so after that, Dick Lord, if we wanted anything, it was as though we couldn't ask him anything, to ask him for too much. He bent over backwards to try and help us always. So that's just a little point about Dick Lord that I wanted to make, because I thought there might be some people who wonder why, what's his preference for the paratroopers, and as a sort of something which really made me feel very good. When Dick Lord retired a couple of years later, I was no longer with the brigade, but I got an invitation to his dining out, his farewell formal mess evening, which I attended. And if I can't remember for sure, but I think there were only 2 old army people there. There was myself and Eddie Viljoen from 3-2 Battalion. And when he gave his farewell speech, he thanked us for being there. And he said he just wants to say that he has a particularly soft spot in his heart for the paratroopers and for 3-2 Battalion. They mean a great deal to him. So, Dick Lord was really, I think, one of the legends of the Air Force during our war, and a man that I had the highest respect for. And so that was really, really nice to hear him talking like that about the paratroopers. And then the last point that I just want to mention about the previous things I've spoken about concerns Archie Moore. Now, Archie Moore had been the brigade commander for 4 years, I think, when I took over, and then I was for another 3 years. Now, the interesting thing about Archie Moore and myself is that we were both teetotalers. Neither of us drank any alcohol. And that was in sharp contrast to the traditional image of a paratrooper. Paratroopers are always seen as these rough and tough, roistering, hard drinking, hard swearing, characters. And Archie Moore and I, neither of us did that. So for a period of a good 7 years, drunken roistering was highly frowned upon within the Parachute Brigade. I don't say it never took place. Doubtless it took place, but certainly where we knew about it, we would put a stop to it, and we wouldn't allow that sort of thing. And so we had a relatively quiet brigade headquarters. There wasn't wild partying and drunken roistering or anything like that going on. I thought I'd just mention that because it's out of context with the traditional image of the paratrooper. But I don't think either Archie Moore or myself were paratroopers in the traditional sense at all. We had our own way of doing things. So I thought I would mention that. But let's move on then. I must say that when I left 44 Para Brigade, I experienced significant emotional difficulty. It was an extremely difficult time for me. I knew that I had to go. I'd been part of the decision regarding who would take over the brigade, and I knew it couldn't be me. And I'd said so. I said, I understand that. But I had now lost my independent command. As brigade commander, I was only responsible to Chief of the Army. Nobody else, only Chief of the Army. And in all my dealings with Chief of the Army, I never had any difficulties at all, mainly because he very rarely came out to see us. In fact, when Kurt Liebenberg was Chief of the Army, he never came out to the brigade during his term while I was there. George Meyrung only came out once, I think, when we asked him to officiate at a parade, and then he was still Deputy Chief of the Army. For the rest, the only time I ever saw them was twice a year at the conference which Chief of the Army held with his command cadre, and that would last 2 or 3 days. And then when George Meyrung was there, he also had his annual team building safari that he would go on. So other than that, I would never see them. They would never really discuss my work. George Meyrung showed a fair amount of interest, but maybe that was only because we would invite him. When we had a big exercise, I was keen to push the concept that we were working towards. So I would invite Chief of the Army, and George Meyrung would always say yes, and he'd make a point of coming out, and he was quite happy to sleep under the bushes and walk through the veld with us and so on. So I appreciated that, but I knew I had an independent command. Nobody bothered with me. Nobody said, you must do this, you mustn't do that. I had the normal parameters that any commander had, but I never had anybody interfering in what I was doing. I never had to prioritize the work that I was doing in order to accommodate pressures from other people. It was a magnificent situation. No commander could have wished for anything better. And I think it was a unique command. It was the only airborne brigade, the only parachute brigade in the Army. So I had quite a unique position, and I enjoyed it, and I exploited it to the full in order to achieve the things that I wanted for the airborne force. But now I'd been shunted out of the airborne environment, the environment that I loved. And my whole purpose for joining the Army in the first place had been to be a paratrooper and be part of the paratroopers. And now that I was pushed out after having reached the highest level of command within the paratroopers, I knew that's the end of the paratroopers for me. Now I'm out of my airborne environment. It's gone. It's no longer there. I also had a lot of difficulty, a lot of emotion around the loss of status and role of the brigade itself, because I saw that with all the arrangements that were being made and the things that were coming up the brigade was now losing its independent capability under Chief of the Army. The brigade had now been told that it is part of the Rapid Deployment Force. Now, the Rapid Deployment Force was a concept that had been propagated by Brigadier Dishonour of the Army Battle School, and it was based on a mechanized force, essentially a mechanized brigade that could be mobilized and employed at short notice. Now, I had a fundamental difference of opinion with Brigadier Dishonour around this. I said that a mechanized force cannot be a rapid deployment force, because if the mechanized force is based at Luatla and there is a crisis at Messina, it's going to take days for that force to get to Messina. And by the time it gets there, half the vehicles are going to need servicing. And there are all sorts of logistic issues involved in that. My contention was that such a mechanized force is the follow-up force, the main force. But the rapid deployment force must be an airborne force that can be moved within hours to anywhere in the country without any other support. It must have its own support so that it can be dropped and be employed for at least 72 hours on its own. That's what I work towards, 72 hours of independent action before it has to be reinforced by a land force. And those 72 hours would give the force back at the Army Battle School opportunity to come up. Now, Brigadier Dishonour didn't see it like that. He saw the airborne capability as a part of the mechanized capability, so that it provided the mechanized capability within a means of for instance, taking a bridge intact so that the mechanized force could get over it. So just a short distance ahead, in support, probably using the mechanized forces artillery, and those sort of things, little defiles, like a bridge or a mountain pass or anything like that, that the airborne force would be able to help the mechanized force to maintain momentum by taking those. So he saw the airborne force purely as in support of the mechanized force, which is one of the airborne's roles. It is a role that the airborne has. But I don't think that made the mechanized force a rapid deployment force, not in my way of thinking. Nevertheless, he was a brigadier. He knew Chief of the Army far better than I did, and he had persuaded Chief of the Army that there must be a rapid deployment force, which consisted of 6-1 mechanized battalion, 4 Psi, and a few other elements. So there was a brigade in being that could be called on at short notice. It was certainly a rapid deployment force if it was compared to the citizen force formations, because it didn't have to be mobilized first. It was already there. But I didn't regard that as rapid deployment. So the brigadier and I had a fundamental difference of opinion over this. But I was going, and that the brigadier knew that. So he knew he was going to win this battle. And I could see that the Parachute Brigade is going to lose its status as an independent formation, and it was going to be subject to others. There were other issues too, which were problematic, because it was going down in terms of command and control. I had fought for them with the move of the brigade down to Bloemfontein, that it would retain exactly the same status that it had at Murray Hill, which meant it was under Chief of the Army and not under the command, the local command. But the OC of the local command in Bloemfontein had 1 paraban under his command because it was in area. And he actually, the OC of 1 paraban had to attend all his conferences and, listen to any instructions that he gave them and so on, and was largely dependent on the command for its support. Now 1 paraban was going to come underneath the brigade, which, if the brigade was to retain its position as under command of Chief of the Army and nobody else, that meant the territorial commander, OFS command, would lose a unit. So he was fighting not only to retain one paraban under command, but to get the brigade under his command. Now, that I explained to Chief of the Army in detail. That must not happen. That's going to be the disaster, the nemesis of the Parachute Brigade. And in my discussions with Chief of the Army, with the Brigadier Reg Otto, who was the OFS Command OC, present, I got Chief of the Army to accept what I said. But I knew that there were going to be developments behind my back the moment I was gone. The other thing that I was very emotional about was that I had planned and budgeted for the first full airborne brigade exercise in the year that lay ahead. That full airborne brigade exercise. And I was planning to hold it out at Loatla, but mount it from Pretoria to make it realistic. It was going to be the culmination of everything I'd been striving for over the past 6 years. It was all the other exercises that I had been working towards this. And I was very excited about it. And I knew that there'd been a decrease in the commitments of the Air Force. There would be more aircraft available. The citizen force that I had at that stage had been built up to a level of expertise. They would have been able to carry out an excellent exercise. Unfortunately, the Marines had now been disbanded. The Navy had been faced with major budget cuts, and they'd had to cut certain things. One of the things they cut was the Marines. So the whole amphibious idea and the Project Telljoy now died. And there was nothing I could do about that. But I could still work on building the airborne capability as much as possible. So I prepared this exercise. And as I say, I'd budgeted for it and so on. But there was no longer a champion of the concept that I had promoted, that I had developed and propagated around airborne. I was gone, and there wasn't anybody who willingly took over with the same passion what I was striving towards. So the paratroopers were being relegated from the strategic to the tactical level. And in essence, everything I had worked towards was being destroyed. Now, this is an important issue, because when I eventually got around to doing my doctorate, my PhD, I addressed this specific fact. And the thesis that I put forward was the primary role of an airborne force strategic or tactical? I wasn't saying that it's the only role, but the primary role. What is the importance of an airborne force? Does it have a strategic value, or does it have a tactical value? And that's the discussion of in my PhD thesis was all about. Because I was watching at this stage, back in 1992, beginning of 1992, I was watching how the relegation from strategic to tactical level took place. And all the efforts that I'd worked towards had now come to an end. That's the emotion that I was going through. That's the turmoil, internal turmoil, and I could do nothing about it. I was now out of the organization. It was no longer my responsibility. It had nothing more to do with me. I had to hand it over to other people, and they must take it where they're going. I've got to now focus on the new job I've been given. I'd hoped for a staff post, because I was feeling so bad at that stage that I thought if I could just get a staff post somewhere here in Army headquarters and sit in obscurity and lick my wounds, then maybe I can recover from the depression that I feel at the moment. But when the transfer lists came out, I was appointed as the officer commanding Group 17 in VIT Command. And that was essentially an urban counterinsurgency formation. That's what a group was. It was an urban counterinsurgency formation, the ones in VIT Command. The groups in other commands were mostly rural, and they were rural counterinsurgency that they looked at. Group 17 was headquartered in the Vaal Triangle. In other words, Vereniging van der Bijlpark and Sasolburg, that area. But it was also responsible for handling unrest situations in cooperation with and in support of the SA police in the West Rand. So they had the whole of the Vaal Triangle, and then the West Rand up on the one side. That was their responsibility. So this is what would become my responsibility. I requested orders with Chief of the Army after the list came out, and he agreed to see me. I said to him there were two issues that I wanted to discuss: my concerns about the brigade and my concerns about myself. And he said, fine, go ahead and tell me. Now, the concerns about the brigade were exactly what I've spoken about. I just felt that I must make one last effort to throw in a bit of influence around these things. So I said to him, I'm concerned that the exercise that I've planned is going to be cancelled. I outlined to him the program of development that I'd followed during my years at the brigade, and how I'd managed to build a very viable airborne capability by means of following this program of exercises. And he knew that because he'd actually attended some of these exercises and he'd seen the capability I'd built up. I said I'd planned and budgeted for this big exercise to be held in the current financial year. But now we were faced with this unexpected move of the brigade to Bloemfontein, and I'm being transferred away, so it's not possible for that exercise to take place in the time that remains. But I said, would you be prepared to find the money for that exercise to be held in the next financial year? Because if you can find that, then the people who have taken over from me, they can carry on with it. At this stage, there's no time for it. The end of the financial year is only a couple of months away, and with the move of everything, and everything has to be sorted out in Bloemfontein and so on, it cannot be a priority. So please, if something can. And Chief of the Army sat there and he made notes. Then I said, I've got concern about the brigade's citizen force. I'm concerned that they are again going to become stepchildren, because the brigade headquarters would be focusing on setting up all the full-time elements in Bloemfontein and reorganizing the organization of the full-time elements in Bloemfontein. But the CF, their headquarters were all up in Pretoria, because I'd had to now find new accommodation for them in the Pretoria area, because I had to hand over Murray Hill to another battalion. So nothing of the airborne was left at Murray Hill. So, I had to find little places to squeeze the citizen force guys into offices in Pretoria. I explained to him what program I had followed with the citizen force in order to boost their morale, boost their capability, build their image. And now the headquarters had gone down to Bloemfontein, and who is going to look after them? The headquarters is going to find it very difficult to do that from Bloemfontein. So I have a concern that they will again become stepchildren as they were before the brigade headquarters had been established at Murray Hill. Again, he made notes. He told me, when I told him, as he said, he told me he thought that I'd handled the citizen force very successfully. But I got the impression that he didn't really appreciate their situation within the parachute community. There were people within the PF who were very skeptical of the CF. And most of those people were down in Bloemfontein, where the brigade headquarters had now gone to. I'd never tolerated such people within the brigade when we were at Murray Hill, and neither at Archie Moore. We did not tolerate people who were skeptical of the citizen force because our formation was a citizen force formation. So all the people that were with us at the brigade were very pro the citizen force, but not many of them went down to Bloemfontein. Many of them were transferred out elsewhere, or they resigned, or they requested to stay in Pretoria because of family situations. And then I also expressed my concern about the new brigade commander had applied to become a military attaché, and that was common knowledge. I said to him, if he takes over the brigade now, within a year, maybe 2 years at the most, he's going to be gone. And right now, the brigade needs somebody who's going to be there for quite a while so that we can establish a degree of continuity. We don't want his removal to impact negatively at such a crucial time in the brigade's exercise development. The exercises that had been planned and the CF, those were the ones that would suffer if the brigade commander suddenly had to leave. Again, he made a note. He made copious notes of everything I mentioned. But what I do have to say is that George Meyrung, who was the chief of the army at the time, his own command experience had all been with territorial commands. He'd never served in the conventional forces. And I sometimes got the idea that he didn't fully appreciate the situation of the conventional forces. It is very different from the command setup. The conventional forces were not concerned with a specific territory. The command OC was concerned with his own territory, the territory that he was responsible for, and what happened in that territory, and the units in that territory. The divisional commands that were the conventional formations, their units were all over the country. And their thinking could not be restricted to a specific area. They must be able to operate anywhere. It was a very different way of thinking. And you were dealing with a very different situation. Within the commands, you had a lot of cooperation that you had to do with the civilians and with the police and with all sorts of other people within your little area. The conventional forces didn't have that. They focused on their forces and what happened with their forces, and that was their focus. There were some citizen force in the commands. There were commandos as well. But they were dealt with in almost a peripheral manner. And the commandos all fell under group headquarters. So the groups looked after the commandos and they let the OC of the command know if there was any sort of big issue. It was a very different way of working, and it concerned me because I felt maybe, I got the idea sometimes that he didn't fully appreciate their situation. And I saw too that, there was a sort of a club of all the command OCs. I think they called it the Here 9 or something, like the Here 17 of the old Dutch East India Company. There were 9 different commands, so they called it Here 9. And it had a lot of status, and they got together every so often, and they all regarded one another as brothers. So eventually the conventional forces, who were just the 2 divisions, each with their 3 brigades, and then 44 Para Brigade, they put together a little club. They added up the numbers of all the different units in their titles, and they gave that to them, and they had this little club. But it was never really a big thing, because the divisional commanders looked at their divisions, and me as a brigade commander looked at my brigade. I wasn't concerned about, brotherhood groupings and clubs and that sort of thing. It didn't interest the brigade, the divisional commanders either. Anyway, Chief of the Army listened very attentively. I have to say that he listened very attentively to everything I said. He made notes, as I said, and he assured me that he regarded Les Rudman and myself both as equally suitable to command the brigade, but that Les's appointment just made more sense. And I said to him, so I appreciate that. I'm not asking you to appoint me in Les's place. That would be very, very unfair towards Les, and it wouldn't make any sense at all. So I'm not asking that. My concern is about the brigade, and that's why I'm addressing this with you. So he said, fine, I'll look into that. Then about my own situation, I said to him that I'm not asking to return to the paratroopers. I know my time has come to an end. I'd been part of Project Redhead right from when it was first established, this project about the rationalization of the Army's forces. I knew and I understood that it made no sense to move Les away from Bloemfontein, where he was already commander of one paraban. One paraban's commander would now be relegated to a lieutenant colonel, a commandant, because it would come under the brigade. And Les, as the colonel in charge of one paraban, would then just move to becoming commander of a 44 para brigade. And I said it made no sense at all to move Les from Bloemfontein just to accommodate me. So, you know, I want him to understand that that's not part of why I'm coming to see him. But I said, but I am concerned about my transfer to Group 17. And this, I must say, it was the first time ever in my career, ever, that I had questioned an appointment or a transfer. Up till then, every time I'd been promoted or transferred or appointed anywhere, I just accepted it and did it. But I explained to him, I said, my new headquarters is going to be 120 kilometers from where I live. That means traveling 240 kilometers every day to and from work. I said, in a group commander, my view of a group commander means that the group commander is going to have so much work to do, and he needs to be there to such an extent that I'll probably only get home over weekends. And the other thing that I've noticed about the group commanders is that their busiest time tends to be weekends. So possibly the weekends that I might be able to get home, I wouldn't be getting home anyway. So it does concern me. I said, I can't move my house at this stage because my daughter is in matric this year and I don't want to disrupt her schooling. I can't do that. And I don't want to put her with somebody else while she's going through her matric year. So it means that my only alternative is to travel. And it's a long distance and I'm going to be home very, very rarely. I'll have to set myself up at the headquarters to virtually live there and accept that I'll be away from home and only be able to visit occasionally. And I'd rather not have that because even at 44 Para Brigade, I have been away from home a great deal of time. So I said, would you please consider another appointment for me that would involve less travel? I would appreciate that. I'm not asking for anything specific, but I'm asking if you would consider that. And he was a little taken aback by that. He tried to sugarcoat my appointment as a group commander by telling me that he regarded a group as a sub-command. And he did not regard what was happening to me as a demotion. I hadn't said that I regarded it as a demotion. So, you know, but I think he got the idea that I had. He said he did not consider it as a demotion. And he regarded being a group commander as essential for anyone aspiring to commanding a territorial command, which he said was, as far as he was concerned, the most important command appointment you could get in the Army was a territorial command. Now, what he didn't appreciate, I can see quite clearly, was that I didn't see the Army in the same light as him. But of course, he was the chief of the Army and not me. So but I didn't see the Army in that light. I regarded the employing of the military in unrest duties as nothing more than impersonating policemen and placating politicians. I didn't regard it as a military's job. And now I was being thrown into a position where that is what I had to do. But I didn't venture to share such thoughts with him because he was the boss. And like a good soldier, I would have to accept whatever he said. And I left his office with him giving me the assurance that he doesn't make any promises to me, but he will look into the situation and see what he can do. And I walked away thinking to myself, I wonder if commanders realize how many people under their command carry out what they're told to do without necessarily agreeing with the viewpoint of the commander. I wonder. I still wonder about that. So what happened was, despite the fact that he had undertaken to do what he could do on both points, and I must assume that he did try to do what he could, but I heard nothing more about it, not from him, nor from anybody else. I realized then that the decisions had been made, that the die was cast, and that I did not have enough sway anywhere to influence those decisions in any way. And I think it's important that I say here that I had, at that time, and I still have, enormous respect for George Mayram. He was a very strong leader, and he carried the SADF and then the SANDF through an incredibly difficult time when the political situation was balancing on a knife edge. I feel, he took some highly principled and professionally correct decisions in 1994. And I believe that the decisions that he took prevented a bloodbath. And what I respected most about George Mayram, unlike some of his predecessors and his successors, he was never afraid to stand up to the politicians. And I think that's a characteristic that any chief of a defense force really needs very badly. George Mayram had that. And I had tremendous respect for him because of that. So my own little drama around 44 Para Brigade and my appointment to Group 17, that all pales into insignificance in the light of the role he played when he became chief of the Defence Force and later the National Defence Force. None of this means that I agreed with all his ideas and all his decisions. He was a lieutenant general and chief of the army, while I was a colonel and a newly appointed group commander. It would have served no purpose whatsoever for me to be confrontational with him. He had an army to run. He didn't have time to waste on a colonel. So I just had to get on with doing my job. And that's what I did. But sadly, I do have to say one thing. It does bear mentioning. And that is, as soon as I'd been transferred away and I was no longer in a position to voice my opinions about the paratroopers. Remember, when I went to see him, when I requested permission to see the chief of the army, I was still technically OC 44 Para Brigade. I hadn't handed over the brigade yet, although most of the brigade had already moved down to Bloemfontein, which is one of the things that I had to oversee, was the packing up and the moving of the brigade from Murray Hill. But now I was gone. I was off to VIT Command, to one of the groups, and I could no longer voice my opinions about the paratroopers. That meant nothing. What immediately happened then is the OC of OFS Command went to see Chief of the Army, and he persuaded him to change the command and control over the brigade, what I'd been fighting for while I was still there. So the brigade lost its independent status completely, and it came under his command, and that meant that it lost its financial control over its own budget. Obviously, he, as chief of the army, could call on the brigade at any time. He could certainly do that. But now the brigade no longer had its control of its own budget. The brigade's budget was now handled by OFS Command. And the vehicles that belonged to the brigade were now at the disposal of the command. And this had implications. For instance, my commanders, when I was at the brigade, were all over South Africa. Cape Town, Durban, Port Elizabeth, all over the place. And if I needed to see them for anything, I had the authority and the budget to authorize an air ticket for them to fly up. And I could do so immediately. I didn't have to ask anybody. That was within my power as the brigade commander because I had an independent command. Now, the brigade commander had to ask because he didn't have access to that money anymore. He had to ask the commando, can I please fly one of my commanders up from Cape Town? And the commando would take a look at it and he'd say, I actually need that money for something else. I think you'll have to make another arrangement. You can't run a brigade like that. I certainly wouldn't have been able to. But anyway, better people than me apparently were able to do that. So they did it. Operationally, the brigade has been relegated to a purely tactical role. It provided a small airborne capability to the rapid deployment force over short distances. The brigade exercises that I had planned never took place. The nearest the brigade ever came to a strategic role after that was to provide small groups to back up special forces for any of their strategic operations. That was it. So my dream for the paratroopers had been shattered. Organizationally, the non-infantry units of the brigade were ultimately returned to their respective corps, and they gradually lost their airborne status. Within a few years, they were no longer airborne gunners. They were no longer airborne engineers. Because within the corps, nobody's going to make sure that they're staffed with that. They will staff the unit, but as an engineer unit, an engineer regiment. And when they suddenly get said, but we want these guys to take part in the parachute. Oh no, we haven't got any of them. Only a quarter of them have actually got parachute training, and they're not all in the same squadron or troop. Because nobody was looking after that aspect. We controlled, as a brigade commander, I controlled all of that myself. And I would say to the corps, I need so many guys in the next intake that are trained in this field. And then the corps would see that it was done. Now the corps was left to just look after that unit and give it to the brigade when the brigade needed it. And they didn't bother. So I'm afraid that they lost that status. Of course, the army was later, as part of the SANDF, was completely reorganized. And that contributed even more to the dissolution of the balanced force, airborne force that we had built up. But truth is, none of that was my business anymore. I could mourn about it. I could moan about it. I could castigate myself. I could bang my head against the wall. None of it was going to make any difference. I was an airborne has-been. I'd come and I'd gone. I had now to focus on the work of a group. So what is a group? In the South African Army, it's a sort of counterinsurgency brigade, a coin brigade, but it only consists of infantry. Doesn't have anything else, just infantry. Usually it had several commando units under command. And one has to understand that the commandos were not a full-time force. They weren't commandos the way people in many other armies understand the word commando. These were commandos in the sense of the old Boer commandos. They were farmers or people living in a particular area who were liable for military service and could be called up to do that military service, usually within the area where they lived. They were given, over the years, the commando's capability had grown, and whereas they were initially only given a very basic modicum of military training, they now underwent the same military training as any other soldiers. They did a 2-year national service, and then they were transferred to the commandos, and they operated with the commandos. So the commandos had well-trained soldiers, but they were part-time soldiers, and they were generally only used within their own area. There were times when they used elsewhere, but generally they were only used within their own area. The group had several commandos. It might be up to 12 commandos in a group. Most groups had around 5 or 6 commandos under their command. There were regular companies and occasionally even battalions that were placed under command of the group from time to time, depending on the operational situation. If there was a demand for it, then companies from the regular battalions, the national service battalions and so on, would be placed under operational command of the group for a specified time. The group was restricted to operations within a clearly defined and specified geographic area. So the group didn't operate outside of that area. It was confined to that particular area. The group worked very closely with the South African police within that area. And it was part of what was termed in those days the National Management System, which would meet and which would include not only the police, but also other government departments to try and ensure security within that particular area. But the police had the primary role for the unrest situation. The army acted in support of the police. The army didn't take the initiative. It was the police's job, and the army was in support of the police. The police requested the assistance of the army when they required it. And then all the planning was supposed to be done jointly. What was very important was that the group commander and the local police commander should have a very close relationship and should understand one another and should work very closely with one another. Through all of this, one must understand that the groups came into being because of the unrest situation within the country. And as that situation grew, so the importance of the groups and the role that they played would grow as well. The operations that they were involved in entailed the maintenance of law and order within that area. And of course, because of the unrest at that time, this maintenance of law and order largely entailed suppressing the unrest that was sweeping across the country. We're talking about 1992 here. So this, one must remember, was the year of the Great Referendum. The ANC, the SACP, all the banned organizations had been unbanned a year or two before. Mandela had been released from prison. The country was going through huge upheaval and change. And there were a lot of political organizations that were trying their best to manipulate the situation and to exploit the situation. And the unrest was really getting out of hand. So it was a very difficult time. And that unrest that was sweeping across the country was meant that the maintenance of law and order was increasingly becoming an issue of keeping warring factions apart, such as the IFP and the ANC. Those two organizations were virtually involved in a civil war. The unrest that was taking place was in many ways just a characterization of this factional battle, because everybody knew that there were elections coming. It just had to be finalized as to exactly when. But the people in those organizations and the population as a whole were sensing that the reality of a black government was drawing very much closer. And so there was a lot of upheaval, a lot of turmoil in the country at this stage. So now I need to say something about my meeting with my new General Officer Commanding, the GOC of Witwatersrand Command. This was Major General Wessel Kritzinger, who was parachute qualified, but had never served in the paratroops, had been OC of the infantry school, Prior to that, I think he commanded Tusai, I'm not sure, but he certainly commanded a battalion somewhere. He was an experienced soldier and a strong commander. When I went to see him, I report to him, dressed in my number 2s and looking smart and so on. He invited me into his office, told me to sit down. First thing he said to me was, "I'm not sending you to Group 17. So I thought, yay, my plea to Chief of the Army has been respected. He said, "I'm sending you to Group 18. Now, I knew Group 18. It was an improvement. It was only about 70 kilometers from where I lived. So it was a lot better than having to go 120 kilometers, nearly double the distance. But I also knew that I was going to be faced with a lot of problems. Because Group 18 was responsible for Johannesburg, excluding Soweto. Greater Johannesburg. So it included Randburg, Midrand, Sandton, Johannesburg itself, all those municipal areas, but also the area of Alexandra, which had its own town council, was a municipality in own right. And we'll get onto Alexandra in a few minutes, a bit more about Alexandra. It's quite a unique place. And I knew that there'd been some serious trouble in Alexandra. So I was wondering about this. But in retrospect, what also happened in 1992 was the Boy Patong Massacre. Now, Boy Patong fell in the area of Group 17. So if I had gone to Group 17, that would have been my headache as well. So I'm grateful from that point of view that I didn't go to Group 17. But when he gave me the reasons, when General Kritzinger gave me the reasons for why he was sending me to Group 18, which was based at Derncorp military base, on the western side of Johannesburg, right next to Soweto, sort of between Soweto and Johannesburg. But as I say, Soweto was not part of Group 18's responsibility. He said the first reason was he feels that he doesn't want me to have to travel such a long distance every day. I appreciated that. Second reason, he said, the Johannesburg and Sandton city councils are mostly English-speaking. And the commando units that fall under Group 18 are mostly English-speaking commando units with English-speaking commanders. They weren't all, but most of them. He said, and I don't have another English-speaking colonel that I can appoint to this command, or to this group, so you're very suitable for that. So I thought, well, you know, at least the discrimination against the English speakers seems to be in the right direction over here. That's being touted as a good point. That's for giving me this appointment. But then he got round to the last point, and I realized what it was actually all about. Actually, I was being appointed because the current OC had been relieved of his command. They had found financial shenanigans going on at the group. A board of inquiry had been convened, and he had been relieved of his command, and I was now being placed in command. Now, that immediately told me that whatever it was must be really bad, because this guy hadn't just been suspended and an acting commander appointed. I was being appointed as the commander. So he wasn't going to be coming back. So that's what I had. What I must also say about that first meeting that I had with Wessel Kritzinger, I knew him from a distance. I'd met him on occasions and so on, spoken to him briefly, but I didn't know him personally. And after that meeting that I had with him, when I left, I felt I could relate to him. I could speak to him. And I felt that he showed a lot of confidence in me. He felt I was that he could rely on me and trust me. So I left the office with a good feeling. Now, Vit Command had 5 groups. So each group had its own area, and each group had commander units under its command. Vit Command was one of the smallest command. In fact, I think it was the smallest command of the 9 commands in the country. But it was also probably the most populous. It didn't include Pretoria, but it included Johannesburg, Soweto, East Rand, West Rand, and the Vaal Triangle. So the groups that he had, there was one for the Vaal Triangle and the West Rand. That was one group. There was another one for the East Rand. There was another one for the Far East Rand, because there were huge townships in both those areas. And then there was one for Johannesburg, which was my responsibility. And then right next to me, there was one for Soweto. Soweto had a group all just for Soweto. And of course, Soweto is an enormous township, very, very big. So, I got to know my new other 4 group commanders, and we were able to, I knew most of them, knew who they were. There'd been a former friend, a friend of mine at that stage, Fossi Vosloo, who'd been appointed as the acting commander at Group 18 until I could go and take over there, because I was still busy with quite a lot of issues at the handing over of the brigade. It was a huge task to move everything down to Bloemfontein. It wasn't a normal handing and taking over situation. But what I became very aware of when I started looking at this new job of mine was, firstly, my shrinking horizons. As OC of 44 Para Brigade, the whole of Southern Africa was my playground. I would hold exercises in Walvis Bay, in St. Lucia Bay, at Luhatla. I'd have exercises down in the Cape, at Saldanha, at Oysterplaat. I'd have troops deployed in Port Elizabeth, in Natal, all over the place. I did planning sessions up on the Zimbabwe border and in the Eastern Transvaal area. So suddenly my horizons had shrunk, and Joburg was my that was the limit of my horizons. It had shrunk unbelievably, and I felt extremely constricted with this sort of thing. That this is my world now. This is where I've got to focus everything that I do. I'd had a headquarters out in the veld. If I felt like that if things were getting me down, I'd walk out of my office and get into my Land Rover and I'd drive into the veld, and it'd just be bushveld around me, and it was wonderful. There was no way I could do that. Yeah, Derncorp was surrounded by mine dumps and buildings and suburbs and townships and all the rest. So I had to start doing a mind change. I had to start adjusting to this huge change that I was faced with. Joburg wasn't unknown to me. As a young man, I'd lived there for several years. I'd worked there. I knew Joburg very well. I didn't have any problem with Joburg, but I had no desire to live there, and even less desire to work there. It didn't really appeal to me. But I didn't have anything against the place. I had very good memories about Joburg and so on. But in focusing now at what is it that I'm faced with here? The unrest in the country was at its height at that stage. Things were really bad. And it very quickly became clear to me that my focal point was Alexandra Township. But there was also unrest being fomented from and around the large hostels of migrant workers inside Joburg. Now, Joburg's got places like Denver and George Goch and so on, There are huge hostels. All the mines have got hostels. These are all single-sex hostels, and most of them are occupied by men, and many of them are extremely aggressive men and very frustrated men. And these hostels were a nightmare, and they were all within my area of responsibility as well. I also had the Nasrec organization, the great big showgrounds that had been built very close to my headquarters. I was responsible for the security or liaising with Nasrec for the security. They had their own security capability there, but I had to liaise with them so that if things got out of hand, I could get a force there to help them out as quickly as possible. And I had a few little headaches of my own. The command headquarters was at a place called Armadale Place, which was a huge building right in the middle of Johannesburg, in the CBD. And although they had their own guards and so on, if any crisis arose, it was my responsibility to go and protect that place. And then I also had the GOC had an official house that he lived in Johannesburg. I think it was in Linden. I can't quite remember, but it was around there. And I had to keep an eye on his house. And make sure that his house was okay as well, with his wife and family and so on. So I had little headaches that a lot of other group commanders didn't have to worry about. The forces I had at my disposal, I had a group headquarters with staff. So as I had with the brigade, I had personnel, intelligence, ops, and log and fin. I had 5 urban commandos. They were all in the urban areas. There was Johannesburg West Commando. There was Wemapan Commando. There was East Park Commando. There was Randburg Commando. And there was Sandton Commando. Those were the 5 commandos under my headquarters. I found out that my predecessor, the guy who had been relieved of his command, he had sent in a motivation for disbanding 3 of the commandos. So there would only be 2 left. And the first thing I did when I got to the group was to sit down and examine the situation and do an assessment and draw up some sort of appreciation based on the information I could get together from intelligence, from briefings, from visiting people, from going to places and so on. And I thought to myself, this is crazy. How can anybody want to disband commandos in the midst of what we're going through at the moment with the unrest? So I went to see the GOC and I said to him, sir, I think this is a mistake. We shouldn't disband those commandos. He said to me, you're the group commander. If you think that's what's necessary, you submit a motivation. He said, at this stage, they're in the process of disbanding. You better submit a motivation and tell me why not. So I did, and the decision was fortunately reversed. And the commando OCs were very grateful to me for it, and I think it was beneficial in the long run. But anyway, so besides those 5 urban commandos that I could call on at any moment, we could call on them to mobilize their troops and to use their troops, and I could schedule their troops because they all had obligations, military obligations that had to be met. So I could make use of those to obtain those troops at different times. There were also usually between 2 and 3 attached companies of national service troops or short-term troops. For instance, if we got troops from like 3-2 Battalion, they weren't national servicemen, but they were full-time. If we got troops from one parabon, the one company that did several tours of duty with me was B Company, my old company. They were black troops who'd been recruited, and they weren't national servicemen, but they were full-time. They had a short-term agreement that they would be serving for. At one stage, I had a few companies from 6-1 Mechanized Battalion Group and their headquarters that served under me there as well. It was Gerard Lowe who was commanding them at that stage. So, and they did in fact, all the companies that I had did very good work for me. I had a Provo outpost the military police. I had my own little military police outpost. And I had a light workshop troop. So those were the forces I had at my disposal. But I had a few other responsibilities too that were real nightmares for me. The first is that I was responsible for administering Derncorp military base. Now, that base was like a small town. It had 80 family housing units, military accommodation for 80 families. So you had streets and you had houses and you had fences and there was all the maintenance that had to be done and the security had to be provided and you know, the roads kept in shape and all that sort of thing. That was all the sort of junk that I found myself living with. I had to maintain the Command Defence Sports Club's facilities. They were all in Derncorp military base. And, you know, I was the last guy who should have to do that because I'm not a great guy for sports. But this was a big issue now. The Command Defence Sports Club at facilities were all there. And I had to maintain them and secure them. Inside Derncorp military base, there were 3 messes. 3 messes. And there was accommodation for 700 troops. So there was a battalion-sized base that I had to run as well and maintain and keep that going. I wasn't excited about any of that because I didn't have an HQ unit to do it. I had to do it myself with my little command headquarters. And then I discovered that I'm also chairman of the VIT Command Officers Club, ex officio, because I'm Group 18 OC and the Officers Club is in my headquarters, in my base. I am automatically chairman of the VIT Command Officers Club. That's the last thing I wanted to have to do because that's a whole lot of administrative stuff. Most guys love that sort of thing, you know. That's a nice social sort of. I was bitterly unhappy about that, but that's I could do nothing about it. And as I've said, the security and safety of the GOC's home. So I had a few little other extras as a commander, as a group OC, that other group commanders don't have. And I looked sometimes with great envy at my fellow group commanders within VIT Command, because none of them had this sort of nonsense that they had to worry about. They could focus just on the operations. Anyway, there was no formal handing and taking over for me. My predecessor had been relieved of his command and suspended from duties. And he was facing a possible court-martial for fraud and for theft. So I couldn't do any handing and taking over from him. He wasn't really allowed on the premises. So I just had to walk in and pick up the bits and pieces on my own from wherever, you know, find out what I could, which wasn't much fun, I can tell you. And to my great consternation, I very, very quickly discovered that the extent of the corruption within the unit far exceeded what I'd been told. There was large-scale pilfering and sale of rations. There was theft of vehicle tires and spare parts. Considerable amounts of money had disappeared from the Officers Club, the Regimental Fund, the Ladies Association, and a Kosblik canteen, the Ladies Association of the Command, under the GOC's wife, had a special canteen and it was run from a sort of a trailer called the Kosblik, from which they generated funds. But some of that money was missing as well, because the group had to run that thing for the Ladies Association. We were landed with all sorts of, you know, stuff that I regarded as absolute junk, certainly stuff that I never had at the brigade. Even the petty cash, money had gone missing from the petty cash. Now, you know, it was beyond me how these things could have been happening. But I sat with a gebakte pere and how I've got to sort this lot out and try and get. So I had to start taking some radical steps. And start really trying to make get something sorted out. Of course, when you found that something has gone wrong, then what you do is you report it to the military police. And if it's something that of a highly sensitive nature, you can maybe go to counterintelligence, for which I would have to go. I didn't have a counterintelligence capability. I would go to the Command OC for that. But mostly, if it was money that it was missing or something like that, then you go report this and make a case with the military police. And I had a pro outpost in my group, and what do? I'm checking through my things. I get a letter there. I find a report from the director of Provo, the chief of the military police in Pretoria. A negative report about my pro outpost, casting aspersions on them in the light of all the other things that have gone wrong here. So I thought to myself, what's the point of reporting anything to these guys? They're probably part of it. You know, it's much like the whole of South Africa with the police these days. Then I discovered that there were indications of spying within the base, and that telephones had been bugged. Now, you see, that sort of thing, then I would need to get hold of counterintelligence. They need to start looking into that. And it seemed to me that everybody in my headquarters was implicated in something illicit or illegal. And now I'm supposed to run a group with this sort of chaos going on. And apparently it had been going on for several years, but it had never been discovered. It only just been discovered, and that's why they fired the group commander. My staff, the guys I've got to rely on, the guys that work with me, the SO1 Purse, the commandant, he suffered from amnesia. I discovered that sometimes he would disappear for days at a time, and nobody could find him, and he'd disappear with a military vehicle. And then they'd find him wandering around in Durban somewhere, and he's got no idea how he got there or what he's doing there. And he wasn't up to anything, I don't think so, from what I can remember of the guy. He wasn't up to anything illegal, but he had a problem. He shouldn't have been an SO1 Purse. He should have been in a hospital somewhere. The SO2 intelligence that I had, the guy who was running intelligence for the group, he had been photographed by the ANC indulging in homosexual activities and was being blackmailed. So he'd been suspended. So when I got there, there was no intelligence. Fortunately, I got a young captain transferred in, Ricky Diedrichs, who was the wife of what was his name? That guy, highly decorated Special Forces guy. Didis. Anyway, Didis, we all call him Didis. His wife was there, and she was above suspicion. So, you know, I could at least rely on her. But there was nothing. She had to start building up some intelligence picture from nothing. The SO1 log, responsible for all the logistics support, I found that he'd been suspended for fraud. The SO2 Finn, who was looking after the finances, he'd been arrested. He was in jail. I had a whole headquarters that belonged in a circus, either a circus or a jail. You know, how are you going to run a group with this sort of setup? There were only two people that I dared to trust. Only two. The one, and they'd both been transferred in the same time as me. That's why I could trust them. They were not part of this thing in the past. The one was my SO1 Ops, who was also my second in command, and he was Commandant Henk Reeders, an Armored Corps officer who was very good and who I was extremely grateful to have on my staff. He stood by me in all the chaos. He was quite happy to sit in the ops room and make sure that everything happened. So that I could get out and do other things, because for me, being at my headquarters was a depressing experience. And the other person I could rely on was the one I've already mentioned, my new SO3 Int, Captain Ricky Diedrichs. And later, I got a new SO2 Int, Major Pitt Slow, who was transferred in. He'd previously been in counterintelligence at the group at the command HQ, and I worked well with him. He did well. So slowly and a little bit at a time, I sorted out the chaos and managed to get some of the worst crooks fired. I changed almost everything at the group, and I upset the entire routine. I did everything differently, and I became extremely unpopular. And I did it deliberately. The place needed a shake-up, and I had to shake it up. I also suffered or endured or ensured a massive loss of popularity amongst people outside of the group. For instance, I phoned the GOC's wife, my boss's wife, and I asked her to please remove the Kospluk trailer, this canteen, from Derncorp, because I was terminating its operation. It's no longer going to function. First, we got to sort out the finances. We can't have this thing selling when there's money missing and so on. Yeah, she was very upset with me. So that didn't make me popular with the GOC. But I said, I'm sorry. I don't want it on the property. Take it away. I'm doing an investigation into this whole thing. I phoned the command sergeant major. He'd been doing an inspection somewhere, and he'd found some of my troops that were guarding the Nasrec facility. It was coming up to the Randies to show, and there were a whole lot of things I had to do in connection with them to sort things out at Nasrec. And I had guards there at the facility, and he'd gone to the guards and he'd started issuing instructions to them, telling them, you don't do this here, and you go there, and you do that, and you do the other thing, and so on. So I phoned him. He's the command sergeant major. He's a senior sergeant major in the command. And I said, listen, Sergeant Major, don't you ever issue any instructions to my troops again. They are my troops. They're not your troops. If you want to speak to my troops, you come and speak to me and get permission to do it. Do we understand each other? Or do you want me to discuss it with the GOC? He was upset with me, but he accepted. He accepted. He said, no, he won't do that again. So, you have to start acting tough to try and put your stamp on this chaotic situation. I phoned the OC of the Witwatersrand Medical Command, and I told him, much to his consternation, in Wit Command we made use of the J.G. Strydom Hospital. And there were military medical officers stationed there, and when guys had to report sick and so on, instead of having to go all the way to Pretoria and do it at one military hospital, they had this facility at the J.G. Strydom Hospital. So I phoned him and I said to him, listen, your MO, your medical officer at J.G. Strydom is handing out sick leave to my troops far too easily. I want you to put a stop to that, please. People are not to be given sick leave unless they absolutely need it. I need those troops to do work. I don't need them to sit around waving sick leave reports that they get from your MO because your MO thinks it's easier to just give them a. Oh, he was so annoyed with me. So I wasn't making myself popular, but I was fed up because what had happened to my brigade. So I was not in a happy frame of mind, and yet I find all this chaos over there. So I was like a bear with a sore head. I wasn't very pleasant to people at that stage. Now, as I discovered more problems and more dishonesty within my headquarters, I reported certain of them to the MPs, who I also regarded as crooks. So I was circumspect about how I did that, and to counterintelligence. The fact is, I didn't have time to get involved in doing investigations myself. I had a job to do. My primary job was the security situation within the Johannesburg area, the group's area of responsibility. So that's what I did. It wasn't very long after I got there, then the Officers Club had to have an AGM. Now, the AGM, the annual general meeting for an Officers Club, traditionally, at the end of the Officers Club meeting, the chairman will invite everybody who's attending the meeting to have a drink at the bar at the expense of the club. The club will pay for everyone to have a drink at the bar. It's a tradition in the military. It's what happens. So all the people arrived, including the GOC wasn't there, but his chief of staff, the brigadier, was there. And the brigadier was quite, he was fond of socializing at the pub when on a Friday evening and things like that. So they're all sitting there, and so I get up and I give them a report. Now, I haven't been there long enough to tell them all the detail about what had happened in the past year, because I didn't know about it. But I explained to them that the chaos which exists with the whole the corruption that has gone, and how much money has been missing, and we can't find it, and we're trying to sort out the problems over here. So I said, so I have to give you the unfortunate news that I'm closing the club's bar facility. We are no longer going to have, nobody can buy any booze at this bar. Until I've sorted out the finances, it's closed. I hope you all understand that, and I hope you all appreciate it. So, there was people mumbling and not very comfortable about it and so on. The headquarters at Armadale Place, they had a small bar of their own. I don't quite know how that operated, but it wasn't my concern. It wasn't part of me. So they could still have their little social gatherings around the bar at Armadale Place, but they couldn't come out to the relaxing atmosphere in the club and so on, because that was now closed. Yeah, but they understand that this is, one or two had things to say and put their hands up and wanted to object or something with that. But, surely we can find. So I said, look, maybe there are other ways of doing it, but I'm the chairman, and this is the way I'm doing it. I'm responsible for this thing, and until I've sorted out the finances, no, the bar's closed. Okay. Anyway, so we get to the end of the meeting, and I say, thank you all for being here. I appreciate it, and I'm glad to see that you understand the situation. Goodbye. So the brigadier gets up and he says, what about our free drinks? So I looked at him, I said, Brigadier, I don't want to say to you, didn't you understand what I said? But I'm afraid I'm going to have to say, didn't you understand me, sir? The bar's closed. He said, but this is a tradition in the military. At the end of the AGM, the club owes us all a drink. I said, so I'm sorry. The club doesn't owe you anything. The club's got no money. The club can't give free drinks to anybody. The club is closed. The bar is closed. No drinks will be sold from here until I've sorted it out. Yeah. There and then, my good relationship with the chief of staff came to an end. So, things were not looking great for me in this group to try and sort out this chaos. But I knew that even if the GOC disagreed with some of the things that I was doing, he would support me because he told me to get it sorted out. So I've got to sort out the chaos now. And all I'd have to do to go and say is, if anybody complained to him, would be to say, General, I'm trying to sort it out, and I think this is the best way I can do it. And from my first meeting with him, I felt he had enough confidence in me to back me if I did something like this. So I did those things. And I was waiting for the general to phone me now about this, but I never heard a word about it. So obviously the chief of staff didn't take it any further, and that was it. And the pub at Derncorp was closed. That was it. No drink was being sold. So soon after my arrival, the GOC decided to take his 5 group commanders on a copycat exercise to Natal Command, so we could see how they do things. It was a practice that was followed in the military, which I think was quite a good practice, that you go to another headquarters, to another place, another unit, and you see how they're doing things and see if you can learn some lessons. Perhaps you can do things a bit better if you follow what they're doing over here. So we went down. I don't know. I can't remember how long it was. A few days, probably 3 or 4 days that we were down there. We traveled around and they took us to various places, gave us briefings and so on. And the the GOC decided that we would travel down by train. In those days, the train still worked. It was an overnight trip down to Durban, or I think we went to Pietermaritzburg first. But anyway, it was an overnight trip. And Archie Moore, who had been my predecessor at the brigade, he'd been the chief of staff at Wit Command, but then he took early retirement from the military and he got a job as head of security with Spoornet. So as head of security with Spoornet, based in Johannesburg, he was on very close friendly terms with the GOC, General Kritzinger, because he'd been his chief of staff. General Kritzinger said to him, look, we want to go down to Natal. Can you organize something for us on the train? So Archie Moore organized these nice compartments for us on the coach. We had everything at our own disposal there on this coach. We went down. Nice trip going down. But the GOC was were many of our generals in the army. I think in the Air Force too. I'm not sure about the Air Force, but certainly in the army. It was an obsession to play bridge. They all played bridge. So the train had barely pulled out of Germiston when he calls us all to his compartment. He says, okay, we're going to be playing bridge now. It's probably going to go on for most of the night. I want to make sure that I've got at least 3 other guys with me all the time playing bridge and so on. So I said, sir, if you'll excuse me, please, because I don't play bridge. So he looked at me and he said, you don't play bridge? I said, no, sir. He said, why don't you play bridge? I said to him, I have no interest in playing bridge, sir. I've never played it. I have no interest in it. He said, every officer must play bridge. I said, not this officer, sir. I don't play bridge. Yeah. The GOC was not impressed with me. So, I was finding my shares constantly dropping at Wit Command. And I was wondering how I was going to get through this appointment of mine. I wasn't prepared to change. I didn't want to play bridge. It didn't interest me in the least. So, it's just one of those things. Anyway, so I didn't play bridge. The other group commanders had to sit there and play bridge with him all the way down, or most of the night. I don't know. And when we were in Pietermaritzburg, they took us out to Richmond, and there was a beautiful golf course at Richmond. Now we're going to play golf. So I spoke to the GOC again. I said, sir, I just want to warn you before we start. I'm not a golfer. I play golf if I have to, but I'm not very good. I don't play with any balls very well. I have difficulty catching a beach ball, never mind hitting a little golf ball. So I'm likely to hold you up while we go along. And I would appreciate, because I think they had a 4-ball competition or something. I said, so I appreciate it if I'm not partnered with you, sir, because I'm going to frustrate you. So he said, why haven't you ever learned to play golf properly then? I said, sir, I'm not interested in golf. I don't see any point in playing golf. I don't object to other people playing it. They're welcome to do so. There are lots of things I do that they don't like. They can do things, and I don't expect them to criticize what I do. I don't criticize them for playing golf, but if they want to play golf, they must do so. But I will play golf because you want me to, sir. But I can tell you now, it's going to take me a long time. Well, I tried to explain to him that in several competitions that I had played golf in, I won the prize for playing the most golf, because I would still be on the 9th hole when most of the others are on the 19th hole. So it's just the way it is, Ball sports and me had never been friendly. I played in the scrum when I played rugby, because that's where I thought I'd have the least chance of having to hold the ball, because I'm going to drop it. So, that's it. So the GOC was not impressed with me because I didn't play good golf with him. So, but I played that round of golf, and I didn't play any better than I normally do. So, anyway, to get on to what my job was really about, and that was about Alex. Now, Alex was in many ways a unique township in South Africa. To start with, it wasn't on the outskirts, although it started off on the outskirts of Johannesburg. It wasn't on the outskirts of a city or a town. It was surrounded by white suburbs, which made it quite unique. The other thing that was unique about it was that the blacks who lived there had freehold right. They owned property. Initially, it had been established as an area where black people could buy property and they could grow vegetables for the Joburg market, because then it was still outside of Johannesburg. And that was in the early 20th century. But it had grown into a big settlement within Johannesburg, a permanent settlement, because the people had bought property and the people who lived there were really part of it. And because they were a community, Alex had a genuine community heart and soul. It was different from other townships. It wasn't just a group of squatters who moved in and were in transit or were migratory. And Alex was a permanent settlement with a community sense of its own. The land had been expropriated in 1963, and about 50,000 people in Alex had been resettled in Soweto and Tembisa and other places by the nationalist government, who planned to erect single-sex hostels in the area to serve Johannesburg. And they built 2 of those hostels at the time. But the community successfully opposed those efforts, which gives you some idea of the community sense that existed in Alex. And they had the decisions reversed. And home ownership was again reintroduced in 1987. Of course, the people whose homes had been expropriated had lost them. And, it was a battle to sort of get some sort of sense of community back. But the original inhabitants of Alex were people who, this is their home. This is where they belonged. They didn't belong anywhere else. Alex was granted town council status in October 1988. A black council was elected. And remember, this is, 6 years before 1994. There were 2 massive hostels that had been built, a men's hostel and a women's hostel. The men's hostel could house around 3,000 people, almost 3,000 people. And Alex, as a township, in 1986-87, experienced an improvement of infrastructure. A great deal of money was spent, especially on the roads, because there'd been dirt roads and it had been in a shocking state. And they tarred the roads and built infrastructure, electricity, and various other things. So a great deal, because people realized that this place is not going to go away. It's a permanent place. And the authorities realized they've got to now do something to make living conditions better for the people in this area. So those are some of the aspects that make Alex a little different from other areas. And based on the study that I did of the situation in the Johannesburg area, and particularly in Alex, and looking at that situation in the light of the wider developing security situation in South Africa, I formulated an aim for Group 18. And the aim I formulated was to prevent the violent overthrow of the body politic within this group's area, Group 18's area of responsibility. So we must prevent that violent overthrow. So anything that happens that threatens the overthrow of the body politic, the existing authority, which would include the Alex Town Council, but also the Johannesburg Town Council, Sandton Town Council, and Randburg and Midrand, all of that. Any threat to any of those we've got to act against. We've got to maintain that stability. And that's what we then worked on. And then a few words about the violence inside Alex itself. Alex was affected by the violence of 1976 and 1986, when there was violence in the country. Alex was affected, but it was relatively calm until about 1991, the year before I got there. Then factional violence erupted. The men's hostel, which was known as the M1 or the Madala Hostel, the old man's hostel, had increasingly been taken over by the Zulus from Natal. And it had become essentially a Zulu stronghold right in the middle of Alex, surrounded by the homes of Alex. And the homes in Alex were not shacks initially. It became a shack down later, but they were proper houses that had been built. The unbanning of the ANC and the abolition of influx control resulted in a massive influx of squatters towards the end of the 1980s, beginning of the 1990s. And I'm afraid that political motives played a major role in this. And I'll get onto those political motives at a later stage. But there was a massive influx of squatters. Alex couldn't accommodate the people. There just wasn't room for all the people that were coming in. When I arrived at Group 18, Alex was 2 square kilometers in extent. I believe it's been extended quite a lot now because the East Bank has been developed as well, and I believe it's a lot bigger now. But in those days, it was 2 square kilometers in extent. That's about a square mile. You know, it's not a big area. It was originally planned for 5,000 people. But by 1992, when I got there, it was estimated to have as much as 350,000. Now, there were different estimates, but 350,000, I think, was probably close to it might have been a bit less, but it was. And of those, about 200,000 were squatters. They didn't have homes as such. They built shacks. And given the small area that this mass of humanity was cramped and squashed into, because they couldn't expand because they were surrounded by the white suburbs. Alex was actually a powder keg that was just waiting to be ignited. That's unfortunately what Alex was. There were 20 schools in Alex, 20 schools. They were highly crowded. They were accommodating about 20,000 children, which means that some of those classes were up to 80 kids in a class. But it also meant that there were around about 70,000 school-age kids in Alex. And 50,000 of them didn't even have a school to go to. So this was a disastrous situation. I mean, it was heading for an explosion. It just had to. And what a lot of people don't understand is that the influx of the rural squatters that had come from the so-called homelands in those days was actually destroying the heart and soul of traditional Alexandra. The people that had been there for generations, the people for whom this was home, the people who had houses there, the people who believed in that area and loved the area. Their heart and soul as a community was being destroyed by this huge influx of squatters. And that wasn't their fault. The changes in South Africa in the early 90s resulted, and I've mentioned this already, it resulted in a realization that black government was coming closer. It was going to happen sooner rather than later. And there were desperate attempts to build power bases around the country. In Alex, it was the ANC and the IFP who were struggling for dominance. They both wanted to gain control of this area because whoever had control would be able to influence the way those people voted when the voting eventually came around. It was a few years to go still, but it was going to come. And people knew that. It didn't matter who you were. If you didn't understand that, then you were not using your head. You were living in Margaret Thatcher's cloud cuckoo land. The older residents from Alex tended to support the ANC. The hostel dwellers were radically pro-IFP. And this meant there was going to be a clash. There was just no way out of it. There was going to be a huge clash. And it came. In January 1982, just about the time that I arrived there, 2 limpet mines were detonated on the corner of the M1 hostel. So the IFP is the target, and who is it that uses limpet mines at that stage? So there was little doubt in anybody's mind as to what organization had planted those limpet mines. Short on the heels of this particular, and it required a huge effort on the part of the police to keep the IFP under control and prevent them from going on a rampage as a result of these limpet mines. But then there was a funeral that had to take place of an IFP man, and they wanted to bury him in the Alex cemetery. And the ANC said, no IFP guy will be buried in the cemetery. And the IFP said, up yours, we're burying him there, that's it. So what happens, the funeral service is held at the hostel, the M1 hostel, which no ANC guys dared to come too close to. But when the body is delivered by the funeral home, it's the wrong body. Now don't tell me how that happened. And I cannot say to you whether it was something deliberate or what it was, but that's what happened. And the body had to be sent back, and then they had to bring the new body. But that alone caused temperature to rise in the hostel. And then when the funeral cortege left the hostel and headed for the funeral, for the cemetery, it was ambushed by the ANC. And a couple of guys were shot, and there was chaos. And there were several, so the funeral had to be abandoned, and there were several subsequent attempts. And meantime, the police are running around trying to control the situation. The situation in the hostel was that the hostel was like a fortress, and the IFP guys in the hostel were manning the upper windows with rifles and shooting at the police. Eventually, the police came along with Caspers mounting machine guns, and they opened up on the hostel with machine guns. And that quieted down the IFP because they realized we're not going to win this one. So they stopped that. But they'd been shooting at the police willy-nilly at that stage. The referendum took place in March 1992. I can't remember. I think it was the 17th of March. But when it took place, the day that it took place, Alex, the whites weren't even aware of this. The whites were all happily going off to the polling booth to cast their votes in the referendum. But in Alex erupted into civil war. The houses occupied by ANC supporters were attacked by the IFP. There was a large-scale exodus of people. Homes were looted and they were torched. And a no-go area around the M1 hostel was so badly devastated that it became known as Beirut. The houses were just destroyed. You cannot believe it was like a war zone. And it was a war zone when you went around there. It became a no-go area. No ANC guy would dare venture into Beirut because they'd be fired on from the hostel. And the hostel was a huge, dominating structure that looked out over the area. And guys with rifles up on the top they could shoot anybody who came near to the hostel. about 650 families, non-Zulu families, living in the houses near the hostel, were displaced. They had to go and live in churches, in community halls, and in offices. They had nowhere else to live. The M1 hostel, which overlooked the whole of Beirut, was essentially a Zulu fortress, which housed an impi of around 3,000 men. And there were about 40 Zulu families in other parts of Alex, who the community were now angry with the Zulus. So these guys, the only fault they had was that they were born Zulus, and they were displaced from other parts of Alex. So they fled to the hostel, and there were about 40 such families living in the hostel as well. So you had an incredible polarization that had taken place within Alex. A total of around 3,400 individuals from all the different families had been displaced. It was a humanitarian crisis, and there were relief organizations trying to sort it out. But the violence continued. There were assassinations. One of the big shots in the IFP was assassinated. The M1 hostel was mortared. Mortar bombs fired into it. Children were shot by snipers inside the hostel. If children just ventured on their way to school, walked past a corner within sight of the snipers in the hostel, they would shoot them. The township was swamped with AK-47 assault rifles. And we later found, when we did a search of the hostel, we found an armory with a gun factory inside the hostel, where they were building makeshift zip guns and things that the IFP could use in their attacks. Nightly, there were bursts of gunfire all over Alex. I mean, the people in Alex were absolutely terrified. When soldiers were called in and patrolled, I had to give them instructions that if they are fired on from anyone in the hostel, don't return fire. Because what happened was, if they returned fire and they shot somebody in the hostel, by the time you'd get the police up there, the rifle would be gone. It's just a dead body lying there. And then the soldier would be charged with murder. So I had to tell my troops, don't return fire to the hospital. Just take cover. And you can't fight a war like that. So anyway, in March 1992, the SAP requested that the army maintain a permanent presence in Alex. Until then, I'd sent out troops whenever the police needed extra people to go to deploy in Alex. But now they said, please, we want a permanent presence. We want you to have a company deployed in the township at all times. So then I'd send a company out for so many hours, then send another one to relieve them, and so that I always maintained the presence of a company to support the police. And at first, I provided this from my base in Derncorp. And Derncorp, of course, was on the far side of Johannesburg, right on the west, while Alex is on the northeast. So, we were on the southwest. It was right on the other side of Joburg. So it was a long, long way away. But in May of that year, I established a support point on the edge of Alex, just on the edge, where I had a company of infantry permanently deployed. And they were able to patrol and to react immediately. But more importantly, the troops were able to more closely identify with the population and with the situation that was going on over there. They were no longer outsiders coming in. They were now part of that situation, and they had a deeper appreciation of what was going on. Now, it's important to say something about the National Peace Accord. And the ICC, I'll explain later what the ICC is. But the National Peace Accord was something that had been established in an effort to quell the violence around the country and to try and negotiate situations to just stop the violence. And it included structures that were set up all around the country with all sorts of well-meaning people who were determined to try and do something to resolve the issue and to involve as many different of the organizations as possible it became a very formal structured thing with regional regional dispute resolution committees and then local dispute resolution committees. But all efforts to establish a local dispute resolution committee for Alex had failed. It hadn't been possible to do that. And this was largely due to the intransigence and the stalling of the ANC. I have to say that. Every time an effort was made to establish a local dispute resolution committee, the ANC would say, no, we have to consult more with our constituency. We'll get back to you with that. And they just kept delaying it, and it could never be done. But at the end of March, 31st of March, on my birthday, in fact, I spent my birthday in this meeting. In desperation, the Witwatersrand Regional Peace Committee established an interim crisis committee, which wasn't really a formal structure of the National Peace Accord, but it was something. They had to have something on the ground that would work, and they established the Interim Crisis Committee, or ICC. Both the ANC and the IFP agreed to serve on it. And the SAP and the SADF others were amongst others that also did this. But it took a little while for it to get set up and so on, but people committed themselves to it. And so besides the ANC, the IFP, the SAP and the SADF, we had the churches represented by the Ministers Fraternal in the Alex area, local and surrounding businesses in Alex. We had an organization known as Women for Peace who played a very big role in this. We had political parties involved, the then Democratic Party, the DP, and the National Party, the NP. I must say the NP's involvement was abysmal. They very occasionally attended, and there was no real commitment from them at all. One of the guys that they sent along to this was the later Kortbroek van Skalkwyk, who he came along to a couple of the meetings, but I don't know whether he saw that there was no political future for him in that, and then we never saw him again. So, but the DP were very committed. They were very involved, and they had a woman, Melanie Stewart, who attended every meeting and was a very reliable member. The Alexandra Health Clinic tried to send people when they could, but they were so busy trying to sort out all the injuries and the problems that they had over there, because the people in Alex had to pass the hostel to get to the health clinic. And the IFP wouldn't allow them to go past. They'd start shooting at them. So sick people couldn't get to the health clinic to be seen to. They'd have to take a long roundabout route to try and get there without being spotted by the IFP. So relief organizations who were involved with all the displaced people, they became involved. And there were a few other interested parties who also involved. And the Regional Peace Committee for the Witwatersrand urgently requested that we establish a support point for the SADF, by the SADF, which is one of the reasons why I eventually supported it. It didn't get a lot of support from the military. Even my GOC was not very keen that I should establish a support point there. But I explained to him that I couldn't really operate properly in side of Alex unless I had a permanent force right there that I could rely on immediately. You see, one of the problems I identified right from the first contact I had with the National Peace Accord and within the ICC, I realized very quickly that the security forces were experiencing a crisis of credibility in the eyes of the community. They were not responding to the pleas that went out. Things were not happening. They weren't doing anything. And it didn't seem to bother a lot of people in both the military and in the police. Empty promises were made, excuses for delays were presented, or problems were blatantly ignored. And they characterized both the SADF and the SAP involvement. And I realized when I was sitting there that no matter what I said, the people looked at me with very, very darting eyes. Here comes another one of these promises. This is not going to happen. So I decided right from the start that it's important that this must change. So when the regional peace committee said, please, can't the SADF have a permanent presence over there? That's when I went to the GOC and I said, look, I want to establish a support point at Alex. We'll find a place, we'll find a property where we can put it up, and we found a place right on the edge of Alex that bordered on a factory where we could pitch tents and accommodate the people, have mobile toilets and so on. It involved expense, and that's why the GOC was not so wildly enthusiastic about it. But I said to him, it's the only way I'm going to make an impression on these people. They've got to realize that they can trust me if I say I'm going to do something. So I briefed my troops, and especially their commanders, that the community is not our enemy. You've got to realize this. The community is not your enemy. We are there to protect the community, and we can only act against perpetrators of violence, not against somebody we suspect of being guilty of violence. And we have to treat civilians with respect at all times. And we have got to maintain a neutral stance. We mustn't be seen as pro-ANC or pro-IFP. This is a factional battle. We've got to be seen as a neutral in this situation. So that's the briefing that I gave them, and to a great extent, the troops were very good in doing this. And I must also say that I had a lot of black troops. And a lot of them had their own political preferences. And I would have to say to them, listen, guys, I know you might support either the ANC or the IFP, but right now you're a soldier. And it doesn't matter who you support. We've got to treat them all with dignity, with respect, and with a neutral approach. And what I was able to do was that if a crisis did arise anywhere, I could send my troops in immediately. I had Buffel mine-protected vehicles, so there was limited armor there. I had some protection from small arms, but I had foot patrols going out as well. And if there was a crisis, I could react immediately. And I spent a lot of time at both the support point and inside Alex, and speaking to people inside Alex. I made sure that there was no differentiality between ANC areas and IFP areas, because we were constantly being accused that if something happened with the ANCs, they said, you see, you don't react when something happens here, but when it happens in the IFP area, then you're in there immediately. So I made sure that whenever a crisis arose, it didn't matter where it arose, the troops had to respond immediately and make sure that there was no growth of that violence. It was quite difficult for me to persuade my SAP counterpart to take the same line. Now, I must say something about him. He was a great guy. His name was Hein Kilian. Now, Hein was an exceptionally aggressive man. He was a man who, you got to act now, you don't wait. He was quite impetuous. Now, he was a rooikop, a redhead, and he was as fiery as any redhead could be. But he was a dedicated policeman. He was a man who, if he had a job to do, he wanted to do it. But he didn't have patience. He didn't have patience with anybody. And I quickly learned that with Hein, you've got to be very direct with him. The only advantage I had in dealing with Hein was that he was a lieutenant colonel and I was a colonel. And he respected that. so he never gave me lip. But he confronted me on a number of issues. And we had some heavy differences. But the fact of the matter is that we actually worked very well together. But I had a problem sometimes persuading him to realize that the people are not the problem. It's the bad guys that are the problem. The average people, they're good guys. We got to protect them, because he'd brush everything out of his way to get what he wanted done, and it didn't matter who got injured in the process. So I had to work very, very carefully and very hard with Hein. He also had no time for meetings. He didn't want to sit and talk for forever. But the people you were dealing with, they would be speaking forever, and you had to accommodate that to a certain extent. So I had to get accustomed to the fact that Hein would often send a representative to the meetings. He wouldn't come himself. So I would be there representing the military, and I'd have a sergeant, or if I'm lucky, a lieutenant, who would be with me. And they couldn't make decisions. So unfortunately, we had the situation where gradually the guy said, no, ask the Defence Force, they'll get it done. Because I was there, I would see it. But if you ask the police, you don't know, that sergeant's not going to be able to persuade Colonel Hein Kilian that this is what he must do, because he didn't sit and listen to the whole situation in the background and say, "Ach, nonsense, man," and it just doesn't get done. So that was a difficulty. But when it became clear to everyone on the ICC that there was little chance of a local dispute resolution committee of the National Peace Accord ever being formed, certainly not in the near future, we decided that we'd hold a weekend workshop to try and determine exactly what the ICC's purpose is and what its structure is and what sort of parameters we're going to work under. Because at that stage, there was nothing formal about it at all. It was just there to try and get people to talk. But we needed slightly clearer guidelines in that. And we thought we'd sit down and do it ourselves. And we did that. We had a very successful workshop. But Hein, of course, didn't attend it. I think he sent his 2IC, a lieutenant, to come along. So, but anyway, we held after that, we held weekly meetings. Once a week, the ICC would get together. And because of the composition of the committee, it sometimes went on until 2:00 in the morning. The people would talk and talk and talk, and they talked nonsense a lot of the time, and they'd repeat themselves, and everybody wants to have his say, and somehow you've got to allow that to happen. Now, we eventually got a chairman, a businessman, who was exceptional. Man, he was very good. He was a white fellow, but he'd been involved in work in Middelburg as well, in the sort of negotiating and peace, and his company gave him time off to be able to deal with the peace, the ICC, and he did a wonderful job. He was an exceptional man, and he had a gentle way of speaking with people, but he had a very firm approach in dealing with them as well. So, sometimes we usually met in the teachers' center, which was just outside of Alex in Wynberg. And it was close by for all the people coming from Alex. Sometimes we'd meet even in the hostel, and some other places inside of Alex Community Hall and so on. But generally it was in this teachers' center. And man, I'd get home so late some nights because, I was still living in Pretoria, and at the end of every day I'd have to drive back. But I slept in my office many, many times because it just made more sense to do that. I just had too much happening. What they did was the ICC, we formed 3 subcommittees, task groups we called them. There was the development task group, which looked at socio-economic stuff. We gave inputs there, but we weren't really involved. I had one of my guys who was part of that committee, but we weren't deeply involved in that. The communications task group, which worked on promoting the whole peace accord concept to try and, bring about more calmness. And then there was the security task group. Now, I ended up chairing the security task group. But when I was approached and asked by the chairman if I would do that, I said, I'll only do it on condition that both the IFP and the ANC agree to my being there. Because I get enough flack from both of them. They must agree to it. If they don't agree to it, you'll have to find someone else to chair it. So he spoke to them, and they both said, no, they'll agree. I must chair the security task group in what it did. So we also met as a second weekly meeting. We, with the task group, met. And I ran our meetings very differently. I'd have a meeting and I'd divide it into two. The first meeting would be for half an hour. That's it. Say what you have to say in half an hour, and then we're done. The second half, we would go to somewhere in Alex. We'd always meet at Alex, somewhere in Alex or near to Alex. The second half, we would go into the township. And for every week, we would select a different part of the township where there had been problems in the past. And we would speak to the people there and get the people on the street. We just, anybody who comes around, we'd say, come and knock on a rude door and ask the person to come out and tell us what's going on here. What are the problems here? What do you see as a crisis here? And that we'd spend hour and a half doing. And that brought a lot of fruits. It brought a lot of things that came. Now, we had problems because I had both the IFP and the ANC had given representatives on the security committee. And I'd say to them, right, we're going down to 12th Avenue, and we're going to meet at 12th Avenue and Roosevelt or something like that. And the IFP guy would say, I'm not going. That's in the ANC area, I'm not going. I'd say, you've got to go. That's part of what we do. If you don't go, there's no point in going. No, but I could get killed if I go down there. I said, well, you just have to take that chance. You got to come down. But I can tell you now, nobody's going to kill you. And eventually I would persuade them and they'd go. And then I'd say to them, another meeting, I'd say, all right, today we're going to go to the hostel. And the ANC guy would say, no, I don't go to the hostel. They'll kill me if they see me go in there. I said, you come in with us. Nobody's going to kill you. And so we'd eventually get the people to attend these things. I got to know very interesting people at the on the ICC. And one of the things that struck me about the ICC that I remember very clearly to this day, and the chairman, who was a committed Christian, would say, when we'd all get together, he'd say, right, I'd like us to open in prayer. Is there anybody who'd like to volunteer to open in prayer for us? And increasingly, first the guys were a bit reluctant, but increasingly more and more of them would do so. And when a person prays, you can usually hear very, very quickly whether they are really committed or whether they're just mouthing a lot of words. It comes out quite clearly. And one of the things that absolutely stunned me was how often members of the committee who were ANC would pray. And I'd think to myself, but this guy's a believer. He's a Christian. You can hear it from the way he's praying. But what's he doing in the ANC then? See, I was pretty brainwashed with this. I was brainwashed the fact that everybody in the ANC is a communist and they all hate Christianity. And suddenly this was sort of becoming a little different to me. I'm finding that's not necessarily the case. And so more and more I was able to discuss things with these people and to ask them personal questions about their spiritual standing as a result of what the prayer they may have made. And it was like scales falling off of my eyes when I saw this. I'd never even thought twice about it. I'd just taken certain things for granted. Anyway, I got to know a lot of people in the community, and I became quite well known in Alex because of the security task groups moving around inside the area and visiting different areas and so on. I used to carry an ash cane that I'd bought in Scotland when I visited there many years before. And I always walked around with my ash cane, and the guys recognized that ash cane, and they would recognize me. and my car became quite known as well. So I was eventually, I would drive around unescorted in Alex in my car. I'd have my sidearm on me for protection, but that was all. And I do so without concern. The guys didn't see me as a threat. They saw me as somebody who was trying to contribute to the situation there. I'm sure there were people who would like to have taken pot shots at me, but fortunately they didn't. So, you know, I was able to survive that. And a lot of the people, you know, when I drive around, people would wave and greet me, and I would wave back and stop and chat to them for a bit and so on. And it was all part of the plan that I had, the program that I was developing to try and regain credibility for the Defence Force. We need to be credible in the eyes of the people. They mustn't doubt us. They mustn't think that we're all thugs bent on destroying them. The types of operations that we did with the troops, we did vehicle and foot patrols. And we did them by day and by night. And I always had troops in Alex. Ever since the police asked me to have a permanent presence there were always some of my troops in Alex. Sometimes just a small patrol somewhere, but they were always around. I had a little ops room at the support point, and I had the ops room at my headquarters, which was monitored by Henk Reeder, my SO1 ops. And he kept me fully informed of anything and any developments. And he would phone me. He lived on the base. He would phone me at home if there was some development and tell me immediately. And if necessary, I would drive from my home straight out to Alex to try and resolve the problem. In theory, there was always a policeman with my patrols. They were supposed to always have a policeman with them. It didn't quite happen always because there wasn't always a policeman available. There were only so many policemen. And they had other work to do as well. And you know, I'd approach Hein about this sometimes and say to him, Hein, and you know, I couldn't approach Hein any other way but directly. I'd say, Hein, jou policeman het nie gister opgedaag nie. What's your problem? He'd say, yeah, kolonel, yeah, you know, and he'd give me another story about it, and I'd say, Hein, sorg dat dit nie weer gebeur nie. Because that's the only way you could talk to Hein, you know, and it worked. And I mean, we had a good relationship between the two of us. The police, we do joint planning, and then, you know, based on intelligence that the police got, and the police had some very good intelligence sources, you know, they knew a lot of what was going on inside Alex. And then we decide, Hein would say, we want to do a search through that area of Alex. So I'd say, okay, so we'll provide the cordon. So we'll start that at 6 o'clock tomorrow morning, or even 5 o'clock. I'll throw the cordon around, and then you start searching through. We were not permitted in terms of law to search people. We were not permitted to search their houses. We were there to protect the police and to support the police. That's what we were there for. And I tried as far as possible to stick to that. When we did a search in the hostel, because of the peculiar situation that was there, when the police went in, I'd make sure that there were a few troops with each policeman, so that while he searched, he had people there to protect him. I know that some of my troops used to help him search, and they weren't supposed to do that. I know they did that because some of them, I heard them afterwards talking about, yeah, you know what I found under that one guy's mattress, you know, the zip gun that I found over there, and so on. So I know my troops were involved sometimes with that, but the fact is that they were there for the protection of the policemen. The policemen were supposed to do the searching. So I also know that sometimes the troops came back to me and said, the policeman that I was with didn't search properly through the rooms that he went. He didn't look at everything. I'm sure that there's still stuff over there. I think he did it deliberately. Well, there were some guys who were sympathetic towards one faction or the other within the police, and I'm sure they did that sort of thing. But as far as possible, we tried to make this thing work. So providing cordons is another one of the things we did. Providing protection for police during searches. Assisting the police in the manning of vehicle checkpoints as opposed to roadblocks. Roadblocks is a more permanent situation, but a vehicle checkpoint is something that you throw down just rapidly. Now, there were 1 or 2 roadblocks that were put up at one stage, and we had troops assisting the police there. Again, The troops were not allowed to search the vehicles or search the people. They just had to be on hand in case any shooting broke out or any threat developed. But we assisted the police with this. Then we also had to help the police with monitoring marches and demonstrations. That wasn't so much in Alex, but in central Joburg. The IFP used to arrange marches from the hostels in Denver and George Goch. Yeah. Those streets would be chock-a-block with Zulus waving their traditional weapons and chanting their war songs and come moving down the street. And, you know, the times I would sit with the police commander. It wasn't Wahine for that part because he was only responsible for Alex, but other policemen that I'd be with there, I'd sit in the cab of the Nyala with him. And I'd think to myself, if these guys get out of hand, how are we going to stop it? It was frightening to see the numbers of people all carrying weapons and how they moved through those streets. If they decided to run amok, it would have been chaos in Johannesburg. It was not pretty, that sort of thing. But anyway, that was another thing that we did. And then a last thing that we did with the police was assisting them with crowd control. It's a little different to the marches that we had to monitor. The crowd control was when there was a demonstration that looked as though it was turning violent. And I'll get onto, in a moment, one where that did actually happen. But, usually it would be what we used to call in the military when we did our training was riotous assemblies, dealing with riotous assemblies. Anyway, we had to modify the way we would normally do this because the police had to do it, but we had to be there for backup. If the police couldn't handle it, then we had to step in. So we were there, but the police were facing the crowd themselves. A couple of incidents that took place, some amusing and some frightening, that took place while I was at Group 18. The first one is back to the riotous assemblies. On May Day, the ANC held a huge rally in the stadium in the middle of Alex. And we were anticipating something would go wrong. The police intelligence had told us that they were. So the police had all their mnyalas out and they had their troop, their policemen ready in their camouflage and so on. And I got 2 companies of troops and I placed them in a field just below the hostel. Because we knew that this May Day performance was going to be whipped up because of the chaos that comes from the hostel. And they might try to do something about the hostel. So we wanted to have our troops there to prevent them from having a pitched battle with the guys in the hostel. Because the guys in the hospital would all have been armed and they would have had their weapons trained through the windows. And it could have turned into an absolute slaughter. And the day dragged on and the day dragged on. And there were media people who came out and wanting to interview the troops. And I chased them away and said, you want to interview anybody, you speak to me, you don't speak to my troops. And I had a little portable microphone with me. I think I've still got this. Yes, I have. A little tape recorder like this. And I'd pull out the tape recorder when I'd catch the media trying to interview my troops. And I'd switch it on and I'd hold it out to them and I'd say, what are you doing here? Who told you could speak to these soldiers? You want to speak to the soldiers, you speak to me. And these guys would go, but they'd all start blowing bubbles. And so I enjoyed that sort of thing, you know. Anyway, what then happened in the stadium, they had speakers and coming up with speeches and so on. And eventually they whipped up these guys into a frenzy and they left the stadium. And eventually we got the message. They're coming up the road, they're heading for the hostel. So the police decided at this intersection, we're going to stop them. Now I had to know when to bring in my troops. And I didn't want the police to tell me, we need your troops now. I wanted to know when the troops should come in. So I said to Hein, I'm going with you. So we were inside the Nyala. And I said, if you need the troops, you tell me, I'll decide whether they must come or not. And I had my radio so that I could speak to the troops. And this crowd was coming up the road towards us, and they were chanting and singing and waving sticks and so on. And so the police had their megaphone and they had their nyalas in place, and they had quite a few police that were on the ground with their rubber bullets and their shotguns and so on that they were ready with. My troops only had sharp ammunition. They only had ball. It was 5.56 millimeter, and that's what we would have had to use. So we had to keep them out as far as possible. It's only in really dire circumstances that we could use the troops. And they were all sitting. I warned the troops, get into your buffels, be ready, and you come down here the moment I tell you to, and we'll form a deformation and see if we can get some control over here. Very difficult in a built-up sort of area. We had some open spaces, but mostly it was streets and shacks and so on. Anyway, the police were deployed over there, and the crowd came to a stop, and the guy was talking to them on the megaphone. Hein got the lieutenant to do the talking. I think he would have been swearing if he was doing it, so it would be better if he didn't. So he was talking to the guys and telling them to calm down and so on, and the guys were getting whipped up and waving their sticks around and so on. And I said to Hein, this is not looking good. Maybe you should talk to them, or let me talk to them. So we got out, and and Hein said, no, wait, let's just see. Maybe they're going to calm down now. So the guy was still talking to them, and there were a couple of guys in front who were talking back to him and telling him what their demands were, and they wanted to go and tear down the hostel brick by brick, and they would sort it out. And they'd been drinking, they were and so he's sitting outside, and the next minute, while we're standing there next to this guy, right from the back of the crowd, rocks come flying over. And they hit their nyalas and bounce off, and a couple of the policemen had riot shields and so on, and the rocks were falling around us. And I said to him, I'm getting back into the nyala. So I got in there, and he joined me. And he issued a few orders and so on, and the police started moving forward. And next thing is the crowd started dispersing, and some of them moved up other streets and started coming up other streets. So we had to move around, and I warned my troops. I said, you guys better come down here. Don't debus. Stay in your vehicles. I'll tell you when to get out. And the buffels came down, and the guys went into different streets. And when they saw that the police had been reinforced by the army and so on, they sort of hesitated a bit, and they started falling back. A few more stones came over, and so on. And then they dispersed. And so it ended peacefully. And the head of the Zulus in the hostel came out later on and spoke to me, and he said, I just want to thank you guys. This could have been a nasty confrontation if they'd come here. And I said, yeah, well, you guys better stop your nonsense, because you're partly to blame for this. Don't think it's all their fault. So anyway, then there was another occasion when we'd had a late meeting with the ICC, and the guys had to go back and go home. So everybody dispersed. So I said to both the ANC and the IFP guys came from the township, and I said to them, you guys want a lift? So they said, yes, please. So I said, well, get in. Took I could have dropped the IFP guy off first, but I thought I won't do that. I'll go down into the ANC area and drop the ANC guy off. So when I did, this guy said, you can't take me down here. So I said, just lie down on the back seat and nobody's going to see you. So he did. He lay right down on the back seat like this, and I drove to the ANC guy's house, and he got out and thanked me, and he went inside. And I drove up, and I went up to the hostel and dropped this guy. And he very gratefully climbed out. Only rose off of the back seat once we got close to the hostel. And then I headed back. Now, it was late, and I knew that, if I wanted to head out towards the main highway, the M1, and then head back towards Pretoria, it was a longer way around, and I was tired. I just wanted to get home. So I thought it was wrong. I shouldn't have done that. But there was a particularly suspect ANC area that I would have to drive through. So I said, I'll just go through here. It's late. There's no one around. No one's going to pick me up. So I drove and I came in, turned into this road. And in the headlights up ahead, I saw several people in the road. And as I was approaching them, they peeled off 2 different directions, the sides, and disappeared. And then I knew I was in trouble, because these guys were now, they were going to ambush me. And the road was too narrow. I couldn't turn around. There was nothing, there was no way I could get out. The only thing I could do was to try and get out of this, straight through. So I put my foot down flat on the accelerator, and I just went. And as I got to where they were, which wasn't far ahead of me, the guys came out of the shadows, and they all had rocks, half bricks and things, and they hurled them at me. Yeah, I just lowered my head and kept my foot flat on the accelerator and went straight through them. And I just felt the rocks bouncing off of my car as I went through. And as soon as I got out of this area, I picked up my radio and called the support point, and I told them where I'd been and where the guys were, and I said, get there in a hurry. And I waited, and they got there, and they contacted me. They said they can't find anything. There's no sign there. So they can see all the rocks lying around that the guys had thrown, but they can't see it. There's no sign of anybody here. So I said, okay. So I went home. My car was quite badly damaged, and one rock had hit the pillar between the side window and the windscreen. Had hit that pillar and the one half brick. And if it had hit the windscreen, it would probably have ended up in my face. So, I think I felt the hand of the Lord on me in leading me through that particular little ambush that I got caught up in. So that was not a happy sort of thing. There was another situation on another occasion when we had a meeting in the Alex Community Hall, right down in the middle of Alex. And we had a meeting with the people, with the community, and we wanted to listen to what they had to say, and we wanted to tell them what we could try and do to help them. And we had all the ICC members sitting there in the meeting, and a whole lot of people. And while we're busy talking, suddenly we hear singing outside. Now, I had my troops just outside in the biffles as a precautionary measure. These guys had sort of come in as if they're just part of all the people moving in and out and so on. And they'd gathered downstairs and they started singing. And they came up and they entered the hall that we were in. And it was the ANC Youth League. And that was when I realized, because we had ANC people in the meeting with us. And that was when I realized that the ANC really had no control over the Youth League at all. They did what they pleased. And it was useful to have a youth league and useful to have them as supporters of the ANC. But the ANC really that day showed me that they had no control over the youth league. So the youth league came in singing and dancing and disrupted the whole meeting. And so those of us in the ICC got up to walk out. It was senseless. They were not going to let us carry on with the meeting, and it was frightening to see all these people dancing and waving their fists and their sticks and so on around, and toying around us and so on. So we just needed to get out. And there were several women in the group, and I was very concerned about them. So I called the women closer, and I said, "Come, walk out with me." And I was armed, but I mean, I only had a pistol, a 9mm pistol with me, because I always carried that. And we made our way down the stairs, and people were standing around us, waving and shooting. And some of these guys got hold of fire extinguishers. And then they popped the fire extinguishers and sprayed it over all the people. And we were all getting soaked with this stuff and, the foam that was coming out and so on. And we got out, and I had notified by radio my troops outside to stand by. There's a problem inside here. Be ready to come in if I call you. And then we got out, and the people got into their cars and they left, and I got into mine as well. But it was a frightening experience. Very easily something could have happened, and I was very concerned for these women. Anything could have happened to them. And then there was another incident, which was actually quite an amusing incident. This company of paratroopers that I had, from 1 Parachute Battalion, B Company, my old company. they were in a support point, and they were doing, I think, a 2 or 3 month tour of duty under my command over there. And, they're good troops and done well, and I was very pleased with them. It was nice to have paratroopers under command again, and so on. But one Sunday morning, I get a call from the ops room saying there's a problem at the support point. The troops have mutinied, and they're holding police hostage in the Wynberg police station. I was on my way to church. So I told Anne, you'll have to take the girls. I've got to get, and I got back into my military vehicle, and I sped through to Wynberg as rapidly as I could. What had happened was the day before, some of the troops had a pass, a day pass. They'd had a chance to go off. And what they'd done is they'd gone into Alex, because they'd now made some friends in Alex and so on, and they must have gone to a shebeen or something, and they'd got drunk. And then they headed back to the support point, and there was a police roadblock at the road that they came up. And when the police saw them, they stopped them. And because they were drunk, they got aggressive with the police. So the police arrested them. And they took them up to Wynberg police station, and they locked them up. And some of the guys who'd seen this happen went back to the support point and told the guys at the support point what had happened. And the guys started whipping themselves up into a bit of a frenzy. And because they'd come out in the early morning, this had happened. They'd gone out on a Saturday, and they'd had a Saturday night out, and then on their way back in the early morning of the Sunday, they'd been stopped by the police checkpoint, and now they'd been locked up at Wynberg. Police were perfectly justified in doing what they'd done. They hadn't done anything wrong. These guys had got aggressive with them. They wouldn't listen to what they told them, and so they locked them up. So what had happened is the company had decided no policeman's going to lock up any of our troops. No policeman's going to lock up a paratrooper. That's not on. So they decided they're going to go and get them out of jail. So the company falls in, and the leading element, the lieutenants and the company commander and the others, they didn't even realize what was going on. I mean, it was a Sunday, it was quiet, nothing much was happening. And this company, their corporals get them fallen in formation, and out the gate. There they go, doubling, running loopers, doubling up the road. And they go to the Alex police station. This was when the leader group found out what was happening. They let the ops room know, and the ops room contacted me and said, "This is the crisis." So I get through to the police station. I arrive there, and I jump out of it. I quickly dressed in my uniform, and I jumped out at the police station, and I run up the steps, and I see that the whole company is formed up in front of the police station. And I said to the guys, where are your corporals? And they point to the police station inside. So I run up the steps. These guys had come, the whole company had halted in front of the police station, and they had the ringleaders of this whole lot, a couple of the corporals, had gone inside, and they had the policeman in the charge office up against the wall with their R5s pointed at him, telling him, "You better release our people. You better, we want them out of there now." And the poor policeman, he does. I mean, he was a constable. He didn't know what he was supposed to do now in this sort of situation. Obviously, I mean, he would have probably let them out, but whatever. I got there at that stage. So I came in and I saw this, and I let out a roar. I said, "What the heck do you think you're doing over here? Get outside, get outside." And when they turned around and looked at me, they saw me, they, beetled outside and joined the others. And I went out to them, and I spoke to them. Well, I didn't really speak. I actually shouted at them. And I stood in front of them there, and I said, You lot, you call yourselves paratroopers and you behave like this. I said, if you are paratroopers, then I don't want to be a paratrooper. And I took my beret off and I threw it on the ground. You know, it was time for a bit of histrionics now. So I got to be melodramatic now. So I threw my beret on the ground. And I said to them, as long as you people are under my command, I'll never wear a red beret again. You people are a disgrace to your beret. And I don't want any of you wearing a beret again. And then I jumped up and jumped on my beret. And I said to him, I'm ashamed to wear a red beret with you lot around. I said, now I'm going to conduct an inquiry into this, and the people who are guilty are going to be punished. And they were all standing there in their formation, looking at me with big eyes, you see. And I said to them, "Got him!" And they all braced up. And I said, "Gombale." They came to attention. All black troops. And, black policemen had arrested them. And there was a black policeman behind the counter in the charge office. They were performing with their rifles. And I said to them, "Corporal, you take these people back to the support point, and I don't want any further trouble from any of you. You personally report to the company commander." And I said to them, "Langsom!" And they left turn. And I said, "Rug op die regterflank. Lomasmars!" And they were gone. And the corporal took them back. And I went inside. I spoke to the policeman and I said, "Look, just, this poor guy was absolutely shaking. And I said to him, "Look, just calm down. Don't worry about it. We're going to sort this out. You're okay. Nothing further will happen." And then I drove down to the support point and I passed the squad running down to the base. And I went and saw the company commander and I dressed him down for not having proper control over his company. And I said to him, "There's going to be an inquiry into this. This is a major problem." Anyway, then I phoned the general, the GOC, and I told him what had happened. And he was not at all impressed. He was very unimpressed. And he appointed a board of inquiry and he got someone. Anyway, the whole matter was sorted out and the guys who were guilty were punished and the guys who got drunk the night before were punished. But anyway, deep down in my heart, I was quite chuffed that these paratroopers were prepared to go to such an extent because they didn't want their paratroopers locked up by a policeman. So then there's another thing that happened that was really a nasty thing. It opened my eyes to the reality of the situation. Inside Alex, there were street committees. Now, they were really run by the ANC. And they had taken over because in Alex, because of all the violence, all services had collapsed. I mean, there was rubbish in the streets. There was no refuse collection. There was nothing happening. It was an absolute disaster. There were no water. There were no lights. Everything had gone wrong. It had fallen apart completely because of all this violence that was going on. And I got a message to say that there had been a fire at a shack and a family had been burnt to death. And I went to go and have a look, and the policemen were there and they were checking the situation. And I said, well, what's going on here? So they explained to me, "You see this chemical toilet? It's got a lock on it. The street committee controls this toilet, as they do toilets in every street. They determine which families can use the chemical toilet. And they have a list. And according to that list, if one family should move, then the next family on the list will get a key to the toilet. So let's say 10 families can use this toilet. Then there are 10 keys to the lock, and each family gets a key. And you can use that, but nobody else can use that toilet. And this was all part of the street committee's control of Alex. And I assume that sort of thing happened in other townships as well. They controlled every aspect of life of the people who lived there. They exercised control because the other control had collapsed. There was no control. So I said, so what's that got to do with the family that has been killed? There was a mother sitting there. Both her kids had been burnt to death, and someone else, I can't remember. I think there were 3 people that were killed in the fire. The shack had been built. She was sitting there totally distraught, just staring. She couldn't move. She couldn't say anything because both her children had been burnt to death, and she'd barely escaped with her life. No, the guy explains to me, he says, there was a family who was next on the list to get a key for this toilet. But nobody was likely to leave. And they weren't going to get this toilet. So they felt that if they could burn down a shack of one of the people who had access to the toilet, then those people would have to leave, and then the toilet, they would get a key to the toilet. So they set the shack alight. But the people were in the shack and they couldn't get out. So the kids burnt to death. You know, that was the most horrible thing I'd seen in my life. That was the most shocking situation. Killed for a toilet. For a toilet. But these are the socio-economic conditions that these people were living in. And that was an eye-opener for me. That made me realize that there are people, the majority of people in our country were living in a way, under conditions which I had no concept of. I didn't have any idea that such things were happening in our country. I knew things were tough. I knew that they were overcrowded, but I didn't understand that people could be killed for a toilet. Yeah. That was a terrible experience for me, and it affected me very, very deeply. Then the last little incident that occurred that I do want to mention is a far more amusing one, far more light-hearted one. I was heading home one night. It was wintertime, and it was already dark. And I don't know how late it was, maybe 6, 7 o'clock or something. And I was heading back to Pretoria along the old Ben Schoeman highway. And which is the busiest section of road in the whole country, and lots of traffic along the road and so on. And as I drove along in Midrand, as I drove along the road, I saw a car had stopped on the side of the road. And as I drew level with it, a woman got out. She was a blonde woman, and she was extremely attractive. But she was obviously very distressed and confused, and she sort of looked around her and didn't know what to do, and looked at the car, and so I thought, that lady's in trouble. And if she gets caught out on the road on her own at night, something terrible is going to happen. I'd better see if I can do something. So I pulled over, and I reversed all the way back until I got there. And this stunningly attractive girl dressed in black with her lovely blonde hair and so on. She's standing, looking very confused and so on. And so I get out of the car and I say to her, "Good evening. Could I help you at all? You've obviously got a problem." She says the car just stopped going. It was an Alfa Romeo. She said, "It's not my car. I borrowed the car. I'm going through to Pretoria from Joburg to see my parents, and this just happened." Now, remember, this isn't the days before cell phones, so we didn't have anything like that. I said to her, "You don't have any idea what's wrong with the car?" She said, "No, I don't know the car at all." So I said, "Can you open the bonnet for me?" She said, "Well, I don't even know how to." So I said, "Okay, let me have a look." And so I went over to the driver's seat, and I look, and I see this on the back seat is a big piece of cardboard covering the whole of the back seat. And I look at it, and by now, I'm suspicious of absolutely everything. I mean, I'm living in a state of corruption and chaos and violence all the time. So I'm suspicious of absolutely everything. So I look at this and I think to myself, there's somebody underneath that box, underneath that piece of cardboard. And she stopped here just to try, and they would use an attractive woman to stop. So someone like me will stop. And as soon as I get into this car to open the boot, the bonnet, this guy's going to throw a thong over my neck or something and take me. So I decide I'm not going to get in. So I stand there with the door open, and I'm looking over the back seat. Now I've got my 9mm on my belt, and I'm looking over the back seat, and I stretch in, and I put my foot on the accelerator and touch it a few times, and I turn the ignition. But I'm constantly watching this over the back seat, you see, and there's nothing there. No, doesn't start. So keeping my eye on the back seat, so I put my hand underneath here and feel around until I can feel the catch, and I open the catch and I close the door again. And I walk around and open it up, and I look inside. And now I know nothing about cars. You know, when I told my wife this, she really laughed. She said, "What were you going to look at? You wouldn't even know what to look for." But I look inside the car, and and I mean, Alfa Romeo is an exceptionally complicated car to start with. So I look at it, and I realize, this might be impressing this woman that I'm actually looking at inside her car, but I don't know what I'm doing. So I said to her, I can't find anything wrong here. I said to her, "Are you a member of the AA?" So she says, yes, I am. So I said, "Well, look, let's, there's one of these emergency phones just a little way further down the road. You get into the car with me, and I'll take you down there, and you phone. Have you got your information for the AA?" And she said, "Yes, she has." So I said, "Well, I'll take you down there. You can phone them, and then I'll take you back to your car." So we do that. She gets into my car, and I drive down there, and I'm looking in my rearview mirror, and there's nobody getting out of the car, and she's had no problem with getting into the car with me. So I think, well, perhaps my suspicions are not grounded. There's nothing wrong. And we get down to the car, to the phone. She gets out, and I wait in the car while she puts the phone call through and gives her details to them and so on. And so I said to her, "Have you got your parents will be worried about you. Do you want me to contact them for you?" So she said, "Can you?" So I said, "Well, I've got a radio here. I can speak to my ops room, and I'll get them to phone your parents for you." So she said, "Please, if you'll do that." So she gave me the number, and she says, "Just please, just tell them Sandra will be a bit late because we're trying to get this sorted out." So she says that the AA is on their way. They say we must just wait at the car. So fine, I get in. Now the only way to get back is to go drive until I get another flyover, and then go over that flyover and cross over that, and then drive with that one until I pass the car and get on the next flyover that side and go over there and then come back. And so, we drive and we're talking away. But she's quite interested. She obviously doesn't know anything about the military and so on. So she says, "So, are you permanent in the army?" So I said, "Yeah." She says, "What do you do?" So I tell her a bit about Group 18 and, what I'm doing in the military and so on. And I get back to the car. Now we stop and we wait, and we're waiting in my car, you see, and for the AA to come. So we're chatting. I also tell my ops room, phone my wife as well and tell her what has happened, and tell her I'm going to be a little bit late, which they did. And a little while later they come back and they say, "No, they've let her parents know. They're okay. They're not concerned, and your wife knows, so it's not a problem." So I'm sitting there chatting to her. So I think to myself after a while, I can't just talk about myself here. I'd better ask a woman something about herself. So I say to her, what line of work are you in? So she says, "Oh, I'm an actress." So I think to myself, an actress. Yeah. There's something familiar about this woman, but I don't, I don't go to movies much, and I very, very rarely watch TV, and I'm not really up to date with all the actors and actresses and so on. And this is South African. I probably wouldn't be watching South African movie anyway. So I said to her, are you a professional actress? She says, "Yes." So I said, "Ah." So I said, "So what name do you act under?" So she says, "No, I use my own name." said to her, so what's that? So she says, Sandra Prinsloo. So I think to myself, shucks, now you made a fool of yourself. So I said to her, look, I'm sorry. You know, I mean, Sandra Prinsloo just happens to be probably one of the best known actresses in South Africa. So, so I said to her, look, I'm sorry, you must forgive me. I don't watch much TV or any movies or go to the theater or anything. I'm just a rough old soldier, so I'm sorry I didn't recognize you. So she laughed and she said, no, that's all right. It's nice to find someone who's not trying to put things on for me. So as I said, okay. So a little later, the AA arrives, and you know, the guy gets out and he greets us both, and she explains to him what she opens up the top, and he sits there and he fiddles around, and you know, and he got it going in pretty much next to no time at all. But while he's busy there, she was busy with something else. So while he's busy there, I said to him, out of earshot from her, I said, listen, you know, I just wanted to find out, confirm, I'm not, you know, a completely stupid guy. I mean, surely other people would also not recognize her. And I mean, this poor guy hasn't shown any sign of a recognition. So I said to him, listen, do you know who this lady is? So he looks at me and says, of course, it's Sandra Prinsloo. I thought, okay, well, you know, I am a bit of a dunce head when it comes to actors and so on. So anyway, she when this was car was going and everything was right, I said to her, listen, would you mind if I took a photograph of the two of us together, because I think when I get home my wife's not going to believe me. So she says, of course, not a problem. So I got the AA mechanic to take my camera, because I always kept a camera with me because of the problems in Alex. And so he took a photo of this, and I said, would you mind just signing it or giving me something that I could put with a photo? So she wrote a little note for me and signed it, and you know, something to the effect of, it's nice to know that there are still gentlemen around in the world, and so on, Sandra Prinsloo. So I've kept that's a nice little memento, you know, but it didn't reflect well on me as a guy who's aware of what's going on in the country. Of course, then something I'd like to say about the referendum that took place that year. When the referendum took place, my own view, I just give my own view around this. I was very aware in the country that there was growing polarization in the country. I was aware that the violence was growing, and when I got to Alex, I only then fully understood the extent that the violence had reached and what was actually taking place. And I knew that our country is a smoking powder keg. I also knew that the time was running out. A lot of people say, especially these days, I like to say, apartheid could have continued for another 15 years. There was no reason to hand over at that stage. Well, 15 years of what? 15 years of growing tensions, of increased violence, and because of the violence of increased repression of the majority in the country. Who needs that kind of 15 years? Because if you say it could have gone on for another 15 years, you're still saying it wasn't tenable. It couldn't last forever. It had to come to an end. So let me be quite honest about it. I voted yes. I did. I had no problem about it. I knew we had to change. I also knew that the whites in South Africa needed to make a statement and say where they stood, because the whole world was saying one thing about them, and the opposition within the country was saying one thing about them. It's time the whites stood up and said, this is what we say. So I think that's what should happen. So I voted yes. And I don't regret that. To this day, there have been all sorts of things, terrible things that have happened. That's got nothing to do with whether I voted yes or not. That's got nothing to do with whether F.W. de Klerk or anybody else handed over the country, or whether the negotiations were a mess. The fact of the matter is, that opportunity was given to the majority, and if the majority have messed up, the only fault lies with the majority, not with anything that happened then, not with the people who voted in the referendum. So I have no regrets about that, and I'm quite adamant about saying it. To the extent that the night before the referendum, I sat down and I wrote out my letter of resignation. I said that in that letter, I said, look, I'd now, as far as I was concerned, I'd come where I wanted to go. I'd achieved the opportunity of being a brigade commander. I'd commanded paratroopers in battle. I'd reached the rank of colonel. I didn't have many ambitions left in the military. So the military had no reason for me to hang on to it. But I had grievous concerns about my country. And I felt that if the majority of white people in the country feel that we can continue in this way, then I'm sorry, I'm not prepared to continue serving. I think my time has come. I must go. I'll find myself another job somewhere. I'm sure I can find something to do. So I wrote out my letter of resignation. And I said to Anne, if the no vote wins, I'm resigning. I'm out of here. I'm not prepared to continue serving in the military of a country which doesn't want to move forward. We want to move backwards. I'm not prepared to do that. I know it's not going to be good, and I know I'm going to be on the receiving end when things get bad in the country. But we've got to look at the country as a whole, and we've got to look at the world situation. We've got to look at where we're going. So that's what I did. As things turned out, the yes got the overwhelming majority, and I didn't have to submit my letter of resignation. I've still got it, though, as a little memento of what I was planning to do at that stage. Another interesting thing that happened is shortly after I arrived at the group, I was informed, it was about 3 months after I'd arrived there, I was informed that the Minister of Defense wants to pay a visit to Alexandra because they want to see what's happening with all the violence and so on around. I must arrange to give him a briefing at a safe place near Alex, and then to take him through the township and let him speak to some of the people and so on. So I did that. Minister of Defense at that stage was a newly appointed Rolf Meyer, who knew nothing about defense, knew nothing about the military. I mean, he'd sung in a choir in the Air Force gym. He was known, one of those that they called the Canaries. And that's the extent of his military experience. So he really knew nothing about defense. But the Minister of Defense is there for policy and not to run the defense force. So I knew we had perfectly good generals in command of the defense force. So it didn't bother me as much as it bothered some people that he'd been appointed Minister of Defense. Anyway, he wanted to come out. So I set up a Casper with a map boards on the side of it, up on the east bank, with overlooking Alex. But there was Alex hadn't been developed in that area yet. So we had a good view of the township. And I had maps and aerial photographs and so on up there. I had a company of troops that would be available. My black paratroopers were there. They would help to take him through the township and show him around and provide a protective group for him. He came in by helicopter, accompanied by Chief of the Army, George Mayram. The GOC was there, and the Chief of Staff was there. And I think by then the Chief of Staff had forgiven me for closing the pub at the Officers Club. But the Chief of Staff was very concerned that I'm not gonna do this thing properly, And he kept bugging me about the visit by the minister, and you must get everything right, and you don't sound as though you don't know what's going on. Don't act as though you've just been appointed there. Speak with authority when you. I thought to myself, Brigadier, when I get into a new job, I study the job thoroughly. I won't not know what's going on. Anyway, all the dignitaries arrived, and I had benches out there, and they sat down, and I briefed them, gave them a thorough briefing on Alexandra, and And then I must say that after the visit and so on, the chief of staff came to me and he said, "Yeah, where did you find out all that stuff about Alex? How did you know about all that stuff?" I said to him, "Brigadier, I read, I study into a thing. I don't just walk into a thing." No, I know that Brigadier very well because he and I had been on a negotiation skills course many years before. And he'd been quite funny because he was a very aggressive guy, a very impetuous guy. He just wanted to go, and he didn't have time for sitting down with books and with people and meetings and things like that. He just wanted to get the job done. So I knew that he wouldn't understand the way that I approach these sort of things. Anyhow, we did the minister listened to the whole briefing. He had a few questions. George Meyring, when they got off of the helicopter and he came through to me, George Meyring had a huge smile on his face. And he commented, I can't use the exact term that he used, but I'll use a substitution. He stuck his hand out, and after I'd saluted him, he said, "Ja, Mac, jy wou mos twak gehad het, né?" So there I was. I've got the twak that he's speaking about, and he laughed. So I said, "Well, General, you certainly gave it to me." So anyway, we took them through, Alex, and the minister was able to. I got some nice photographs too of the minister actually speaking to the people in Alex, and interestingly, as luck would have it, one of the people he spoke to was a fellow by the name of Obed Bapela, who was a big shot in the ANC, and subsequently played a big role in a lot of what they did in the ANC. But he just happened to be in the area that I took Rolf Meyer into, and he showed him around and so on. And so while all the troops were standing around with their rifles and, to make sure that nobody took pot shots at the minister, Obed Bapela and the Minister of Police, Rolf Meyer, had a bit of a discussion there. They'd obviously never met before. And so that was just interesting. Then another aspect that I think was quite interesting was I got a visit from the Inspector General, and the Inspector General was a very competent general, but he had a bit of a hang-up about some issues, and people often accused him of being right-wing. Now I don't know whether he was right-wing or not, but I always got on very well with the man. But as things happened, he's sitting in my ops room, and I'm giving him a briefing on the unit while we're there. And his people from the IG organization are busy going through my books and looking at what was wrong. And see, fortunately, most of my stuff, by the time he came, we'd corrected everything, and we could say to him that this is what happened during the years of chaos, and this is what the situation is now, because they inspected all our books and all our accounts and everything else. And they were very happy. The visit, I got a very positive report from them at the end of that visit. So, I'd done a lot of work to try and correct all the chaos that there had been there. But while he's sitting in the ops room, he looks around at I had certain things stuck up on the boards and so on. And he says to me, "Mac, why haven't you got the enemy listed up here?" So I said to him, "General, there's no declared war that we're involved in at the moment, and there's no enemy that can be identified. The enemy is the violence that we're facing, and anybody who perpetrates such violence will treat as enemy. But I can't name enemy by putting up a sign there." He said, "You must have the enemy up on your board." I said, "So, well, you want to tell me who the enemy is?" He says, "It's the ANC." I said to him, "General, the ANC has been unbanned. The ANC is an organization that is free to do as it does, as it wants, as long as it stays within the limits of the law. The ANC only become my enemy if they break the law. And then because I've got to help the police to arrest them. He said, "Mac, you don't understand the war that we're involved in. The ANC remain the enemy." Well, the way I feel about the ANC, some days I would tend to agree that they are the enemy, but really, if you've got to look at hard and fast, I think that general was way out of line to say that. Anyway, I never put up anything like that on my boards. Then the GOC was changed while I was there, General Vessel Kritzinger was promoted to Lieutenant General and went off to Defense Headquarters. And we were all thinking he would become Chief of the Army, but he didn't. I'm actually very surprised that he didn't. I think he would have been a good man for Chief of the Army. So I have no idea why he didn't become Chief of the Army. But anyway, he went off to the Defense Headquarters. I forget what post he was placed in. I think it was in Chief of Staff Ops. But the new GOC was Force Bernardi, who'd come from the command in Kimberley, I think it was. And so this was a completely foreign situation to him. I knew him. When he had been a commandant running a battalion in the operational area, I'd served under him once or twice. And I had a good relationship with him. But I was not under his command for very long before I was transferred away. But when he arrived, he wanted to come and see the group. So I said to him, sir, if, with respect, not much point in me taking you to Derncorp military base. It's just another base to look at. There's nothing much to see there. I'd like to show you Alexandra and show you the conditions in Alexandra and the conditions that the people live under. So he said, okay. So I met him and took him to Alex. But what he didn't understand was that I put him into my car and I drove into Alex. And he said to me, where's the escort? I said to him, no, sir, I don't use an escort when I go into Alex. He said, but this is dangerous. You can't take me in here. So I said to him, sir, the people in Alex know me and they're not going to do anything. You're quite okay here. And he was sitting in the car and looking around. He was very uncomfortable being in the car. And I took him down to the Yuxkai River, where they have massive, or at that stage, they had massive numbers of shacks all around. And I took him out and I said, so I'd like you to just come for a walk with me down here. And I took him between the shacks. Of course, the gap between the shacks was just big enough to get through. You had to sort of turn your shoulders sideways in order to get through. His eyes were like saucers. And we got down to the Yuxkai River and I said to him, sir, you see this? You see the filth and the sewage in this river? I said, this river, the people in these shacks, this is the water they use for drinking. This is the water they use for washing. And when they need to go to the toilet, they defecate on the edge of the river and it all goes into this river. I said, they have no other option. This is what they've got. Cholera is a constant likelihood. Typhoid, this place is a powder keg. And so at your level, I would appreciate it if you pointed this out to some of the people, because there are people in the government departments who are not doing their work. Look at this. People can't live like this. And I took him back through the little narrow passage between the shacks back up to the road. And as we were walking back to the car, there's a guy leaning against a shack. And he looks at him. And the general looks at him and looks a little bit, and this guy looks at him and he nods at him and he says, Middag, generaal. So we get into the car and the guy says to me, when we drive off, he says, how did that guy know I was a general? I said, because of your ranks, sir. You're wearing your ranks. He said, but how does he recognize ranks? I said, sir, these people are not stupid. These people know what is going on. The military is here all the time. They know what the military is. He couldn't believe that story. But I think he was quite relieved by the time I took him out and let him get into his own car and go back to his headquarters. But I felt that it was important that my superiors know something about what is going on. If he's new in the area, he needs to know so that he can better understand when he hears that there are problems in Alex. I found that generally the attitude of my superiors towards my approach in Alex was not very favorable. The guys felt I was too soft. They felt that I was pandering to the other guys. For instance, towards the end of my time in Alexandra, the United Nations had an observer mission established in South Africa. And they sent observers into the various flashpoints to see what was going on. And we had observers as part of the ICC, and they attended our meetings. And I invited them to come with me when I did my security task group meetings, and I paid visits to the people. And they said to me, your approach is working. Your approach is good. The people can see that you're concerned and you're involved. We're impressed with this. Now, my superiors generally, as far as they were concerned, anything to do with the United Nations was bad. It was just bad because the UN had only been negative towards South Africa all these years. So they couldn't see anything good about the UN. And the fact that the UN that I was allowing them to be, because they were dubious about my involvement in the ICC to start with, my superiors. They felt that I should rather have kept a distance. But how do you keep a distance from what is going on in the area that you're responsible for, and being able to make a difference in the area? Because if you can't make a difference, you don't need to be there. Then there's no point in being there. The only point there is in being there is to make a difference. And that's what I was there for, and that's what I wanted to do. So I had a bit of a battle with my superiors. At one meeting that I was at, the Army and General Staff, Chief of the Army and the General Staff were there, and I gave them a briefing on the ICC, how it functions, and what my role is. There were some people who came to me afterwards and said, yeah, that sounds impressive. That's a good approach that you guys have got. Some of my superiors, they didn't say anything, but the way they looked at me and their body language when I was talking to them told me they don't like what you're doing. They don't like it. Anyway, I had no further ambitions in the military, so I didn't need them to like me, and so it didn't bother me too much. I got on well with the UN observers. We had guys from Ireland and we had a woman from Lesotho, and I think one of them was from Australia. I can't remember. Anyway, they used to come along and they were very complimentary, and they were very friendly, and they offered advice, and they'd obviously had a lot of experience with crisis and negotiation and conflict and so on. And I'd rather learn than what I'd get angry with the people, and I learned things from them as well. So, but then came my transfer. All of a sudden, I'd been there just a year, and all of a sudden, I get a signal to say I'm transferred. Now, on the one hand, maybe they felt that they need this guy is taking a liberal approach. He's not doing what we want him to do. He's not suited to be a group commander. We need to get rid of him. That's on the one hand. But I like to think that wasn't the case, because the post I was given was the chief instructor at the staff duties branch of the Army College, which is an influential and important post where you're training the lieutenant colonels in the army, the commandants who are going to become colonels and higher. And if they had doubts about my credibility and my value as an officer, then I don't think they would have given me that job. So, maybe they weren't firing me from Group 18. Maybe they wanted to fill a post with somebody who was competent. I prefer to think of it that way. But if they were trying to fire me, well, they got rid of me, but at least they gave me a decent job to go to. So there were a number of very, very moving farewell gestures by people in the ANC, and they gave me a card that everybody signed and wrote little messages on. And I was very chuffed about that. And about a year later, the UN observer mission in South Africa terminated its mandate here and left the country. And the head of the observer mission, Angela King was her name, I think, she wrote a letter to me and thanked me for my contribution towards peace in the country. So I've got that letter as a little memento as well. I'm proud to have got that letter, even if it was from bad guys like the United Nations. I'm no fan of the United Nations, but I refuse to just see bad in everything. And in the last while that I was at the brigade, I received an invitation to go to the UK by the Special Air Service, who were having a big reunion dinner there, and they invited me to attend and to go to their headquarters and to attend a memorial service. Their part in the memorial service in London, and so that was quite a moving experience. And I went over. I was gone for a week, but it was very meaningful, and it was just nice to know that people like the SAS Association in London, even if the paratroopers in South Africa had kicked me out, those guys still remembered me. So it was nice to know that. So I felt good about that. But then perhaps the last thing I should just mention is that that happened during that time that I was at Group 18. What I call the Christmas ambush. I got a message on Christmas Day. I was still OC. I had another week to go before my command would be relinquished and I'd hand over to my successor. But I got a message on Christmas Day that there'd been an ambush at Alex. My troops had been ambushed. So I thought, oh, shucks. I don't need this right on the last week of my time there. And the guy phoned me from the ops room, and he told me, and he said, "Sir, I don't want you to be concerned about this, but I do think you need to come out and have a look. There's nobody's been injured, and there's been no shooting, but you do need to come out and have a look." So I hopped in my car and I drove out to Alex. And there I found that my troops had been on a patrol through Alex with the buffels, riding along. A section of the troops in a buffel were driving along through Alex. And suddenly a crowd burst out of the houses around them and surrounded the buffel. But the crowd had Christmas decorations that they proceeded to drape over the buffel. And they said to the troops, "We just want to say thank you for keeping us safe and for making sure that the violence decreases in Alex." This was just the ordinary people, just a gesture from the people. So it wasn't fancy. They didn't have big, expensive decorations they could hang up. It was just little things that they'd made themselves, and you could barely see them, but I mean, they'd hung them all over. The troops were so touched by it. They couldn't believe it. And I went to the area where it happened, and I thanked the people and so on. They said, no, we thank you people. You SADFs, they called us the SADFs for SADF. You SADFs have done a wonderful work here. We really appreciate what you've done. So I took some photos of the buffel too, and there was even a little piece in the local newspaper about it. So it was a nice gesture, and it was a nice way to end my time at Group 18. It wasn't a job that I wanted. It wasn't a choice that I would have made if I'd gone there. You've been given a choice of where to go, but it's what happened. It's where I went, and it was a moving experience, a definitive experience in my life. I think. If anyone had to ask me how did I experience my year at Group 18, a couple of things I would say. I would say, first of all, it was an eye-opener to me. It exposed to me the life of the majority in our country. Furthermore, I would say that my time at Group 18 was totally dominated by the events in Alex, a town with a sad history that was caught up in the violence of our times. It was very sad to see what had happened in Alex. I learned that the original inhabitants of Alex are vital, strong people with an identity of their own, and that by far the majority of them are peace-loving and friendly. And I think people need to understand that usually when violence occurs, it's perpetrated by a minority. Usually, it's perpetrated by a minority, particularly if it's ongoing violence over a period of time. Usually there's a political agenda, And usually there's a minority who always claim to be the majority and to represent the majority, but it's usually a minority. Most of them are peace-loving and friendly. They just want to be left alone. There were only about 86,000 of the original inhabitants left in Alex. And the truth is, it was a physical and a psychological impossibility for them to absorb and integrate the more than 250,000 immigrants, if one can call them that, who had descended on their town and occupied it. The only similar example in history that I can think of in recent history was what happened on Taiwan, when the nationalists came over and swamped the island. But the nationalists came over with a specific intention and ability to develop the island, which happened. The so-called immigrants that came in and swamped Alex had no means or intention of developing Alex. So it just turned into chaos. And as a result, there was a socio-economic breakdown. The demographic pressures in that small area with such a vast population generated immense crime and violence. And then political terrorism was forcing the residents to live in mortal fear of their lives. It was clear that the unrest-related violence that was taking part was part of pre-election maneuvering, Africa style, to form a power base from where voters could at best be influenced and at worst be intimidated into voting for whoever held that power base. And Alex was vital in this. They wanted that vast population in Alex to all vote for them. So that's what the violence was all about. What I can say about my time in Alex, I had been able to play a part in containing the violence. But the truth is the army could only address short-term solutions. That's all we could do. The maintenance of infrastructure, of services, and even of organizations, and the determining of long-term policy, they were not within the army's capabilities. We couldn't do those sort of things. So that was beyond us. But more importantly, if the opposing political organizations could not control their members at the lowest level, and if those members did not want peace, then there would be no peace. And that still is valid today. If the opposing political organizations cannot control their members at the lowest level, and if those members at the lowest level don't want peace, then there's not going to be peace. So political organizations need to realize the importance of their role in the peace process and stop pointing fingers at other people. But those are little lessons that I learned in my time at Alex. It was not a pleasant time, but it was an immensely interesting, stimulating, and worthwhile time, and I learned a great deal from it. Of course, next time I'll talk about my time at the Army College and my time in Taiwan.
I wish that a great many people will listen to this, what you said here, because you were explaining the difficulties which we faced in these townships, trying to keep peace perfectly. And I can tell you, as a young policeman, you would enter a township in a Casper and you would feel quite neutral, but you could feel this anger against the police, especially. For many reasons. I'm not saying the police were innocent at all, enforcing these stupid apartheid laws, which made no sense to anybody.
Yeah.
And within moments, you would be under attack. And of course, you react at that level. It's a tactical level.
Yeah.
And if it was not for the grey-haired people like yourself, the commanders who could keep their cool, it would have gone a lot worse. So that to me, sir, was an absolute eye-opener. But I want to explain something to the listener here. Perhaps we should just explain to them, so why did the referendums take place? Those two referendums, because that was a time when there were white terrorism going on. And these were trained people. These were former policemen, soldiers who could really cause a lot of havoc.
Yeah.
Then you had the other factions as well. Let's call them black, but they weren't all black, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
And at some stage, the government under Mr. de Klerk decided they need to know to go forward or to go backwards. Can you tell us that's what the referendums was about, the yes and the no vote?
Yeah. Of course, you know, the referendum, to me, it was in many ways a relief when I learned that there was going to be a referendum, because I was beginning to wonder what exactly is going to happen. What are we going to do? We cannot go on like this indefinitely. Now, F.W. de Klerk was not my favorite person, and he had a lot of shortcomings. But there's one thing that he did that I had to respect him for, and that is that he had the courage to stand up to P.W. Botha. Now, there are not many people who had that sort of courage. Most people in P.W. Botha's cabinet would never, ever have done that. He was an intimidating man. Interestingly, when I met him, I realized that he's not really such a big man. But he comes across as a big man because he had such a powerful personality. And he didn't brook nonsense from people. I had to, at the time that it happened, I still remember the military attaché, the American military attaché, coming out to the brigade. And he said to me, he was obviously fishing to find out whether there was going to be some sort of a coup attempt or something with the military and so on. And I met him at some function or something, but he asked me this question. He said, "Now, what do you think about F.W. de Klerk?" And I said to him, "Well, I don't know much about the man. I don't know what his intentions are. So I can't really give you an answer on that. But I will tell you one thing. I respect the fact that he had the courage to stand up to a powerful man like P.W. Botha." The guy looked at me and he said, "Do you really feel that?" I said, "Yes, I really feel that." So he said, "But don't you support P.W. Botha?" I said, I don't support any politician. I support the government, the state. I work for the state, not for the politician. Politicians come and go, but South Africa is there, and South Africa is my country. I support South Africa." So when the referendum took place, I think people, what they were faced with was, do we continue with the status quo, and where's that going to lead us? Do we launch into negotiations that will herald a new direction to move in and take our chances with that? What do we do? Now, I'd been around long enough at that stage to know that the direction we had been moving in was not working. It was not working. I had hoped at one stage it would work, but it wasn't working. And it was clear to me that it wasn't working. So I felt that it was time to move in a new direction. And every time it had been announced that we're going in a new direction, and the Rubicon speech and all that sort of thing, nothing changed really. We still kept moving in the same direction, and I didn't see any great big change. Now I'm not an impetuous person, but I am a person who likes a bit of adventure in my life, and I like doing new things, and I like moving along new routes, and discovering new things, and I was beginning to feel that politically, maybe it's time we did a bit of adventuring. Maybe it's time we did a bit of discovery. Maybe it's time we tried a few new routes and then adapted to those routes. Now, I've often taken new routes in my when I had a 4x4 vehicle. I used to love taking new routes, and sometimes even without a 4x4 vehicle. And I've often got stuck as a result. I've often got myself into difficulties as a result. But I don't regret having taken those routes, because I learned a lot of things on those routes. And the same thing applies here. I think that the fact that we got a yes in the referendum, and the fact that we did move in a new direction, that we started negotiating with people who were previously regarded as absolute enemies, and that we actually agreed ultimately to majority government. If you are a serious student of history, then you cannot find any example where a minority oppresses a majority indefinitely. It can last for a certain amount of time, but eventually it's going to come to an end. And it can either come to an end peacefully, or it can come to an end violently. Now, I had no desire to see a repetition of the French Revolution taking place in South Africa. And there are people who try to say that that's what happened. That's not what happened. That's not what happened. We didn't have that at all. So, but if we had it, I wouldn't be here to be able to talk to you. That I can tell you now. So, and it wouldn't be because I'd run away. It would be because I'd be dead. It's as easy as that. I fought for a long time in the military. And I fought in the absolute conviction that I'm buying time, because we're in a dead end street here, and unless we get out of it, there's going to be chaos. But I don't want us to get out of it through a revolution. I don't want chaos in my country. I want peace in my country. And I know we don't have peace right now. I know we have a lot of upheaval now, but it's still not as bad as a war, and particularly a civil war. I'd seen the effect of civil war in Angola. I'd seen the devastation. I'd seen the cruelty. I'd seen the absolute destruction. And our country is brought to the brink of disaster. I didn't want that for my country. I really didn't want that. I wanted a peaceful move. And I think that most people who voted yes, thought about it along those lines. It wasn't just a willy-nilly attitude that, yeah, everything's going to be hunky-dory and it's fine, and now the Springboks will be able to play against other rugby teams, and we won't be banned from sport and so on. I don't think it was any of that sort of thing. I think people thought about it. I think people said, this is not right. We can't go on like this. We have to let the majority have its say. And if the majority have a bad say, well, that's just the way that democracy works. That's just the way it goes. My dad used to say to me many, many years ago, because he died when I was only about 19 or so, he used to say to me, the problem with democracy is that if the majority of people in your country are fools, then you are governed by fools. Probably a lot of truth in what he says. And maybe that's what's happening in our country today. I don't know. But that's not the issue. The issue is that you cannot suppress a majority by a minority and think that's going to go on forever. And you can't think that you can take a knife and make a division in the country and say, okay, this is just for you, and this is just for you, and that's just for you. Particularly if you're saying we're going to divide it up like this, but the benefits, the big benefits, they must come to the part that I'm living in. That's not tenable. It doesn't work. So my opinion about the referendum is that it placed South African whites in a position where they had to state their case. They had to say where they stood. And I think they did. And I think they did a good job. I don't think that the guys who took over the country have done a good job. I think they've done an atrocious job with our country. But I think we did the right thing. And it's better to be right than it is to be wrong. Just because wrong looks right or looks more comfortable doesn't make it right. So that's my view. Not a popular view, but it's my view.
It's not a popular view right now, but it was the right decision. It was on the right side of history, sir.
Correct.
Because it gave the white South African a chance to say, we ended this.
Yeah.
We could have gone to carry on. Military, we could have carried on for one.
Yeah.
But the fact is, we made that decision twice. Twice we said, enough, bring the changes. What happened afterwards, you know, sir,
that's a different issue.
The SADF, not the fault of anybody. Now, I found this fascinating, I must tell you. I was many times worried about the army in the townships. I felt they were poorly equipped, especially in their buffels, because you were quite vulnerable on a buffel, besides the fact that you were drunk, which weighed like a damn ship. It was horrible.
Yeah, and it's open on top. It's very vulnerable.
It's open, you know, the fire bombs and the things could go through. The wires could go through, which they had. So I think it took a lot of guts for them, and then they had to trust the police constable standing there, you know, who will tell them when to shoot and not to shoot. It's just a dreadful amount of responsibility.
Yeah.
But they were very professional, sir. The ones I've worked with, the army, they were smart in the sense of military discipline, smart.
Yeah.
They were clever people too. I'm not saying they were not, but I liked working with the army. They were very keen. You know, they were never negative. In the police, I found we were often, perhaps we were burnt out at some stage.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that.
Very negative, very like, we don't do it anymore. What I will say to people is I've got a huge dislike in barbecues in the townships because of the smell of the necklaces and the smell of the burning.
Yeah.
And then you have the barbecue, it's the same smell.
Yeah.
Many times we just stopped doing the barbecue thing, and it was tough times. It was tough times. So I'm very glad for this episode. I'm looking forward to the next one. I think your career, sir, even though it's not in the paratroopers perhaps anymore, it was still fantastic. It's still a lot to
yeah, it remained interesting.
Well, Internet, we've come to the end of this episode. Fascinating one. Thank you, sir. You know, once again, I think for people who's been there, this is an eye-opener, and for those who's not been there, of course, it's an eye-opener for them as well. Brought many memories to me, some good, some very bad, but I think it was summarized perfectly. Thank you for that, sir. Until we meet again, for the rest of you, you know the story by now. If you want to tell me your story, if you want to, you know, just come and talk to me. It's not hard. You're welcome here. Until we meet again, God bless.